of our Millennia and Microcosm series. We're continuing I guess, our major second part two on medieval civilization. We're in chapter 5, which is the first of the chapters about medieval civilization. We're on paragraph 10. And as is our way with Kenneth Smith's writing, we are taking our time unpacking the text, showing the way that he's using language in very precise, directed ways to try to draw our attention to certain things. We're exploring how he's pointing the finger out of his text to other philosophers, other writers, even artists or musicians, trying to get us to take into account hi Geneva, the whole history of discussions in this area. And of course, we're bringing our own experiences and observations to it so that we can really process and try to understand this. Chapter 5 is a particularly important one because it's introducing the shift from the ancient worldview to the medieval worldview. So this is where most of the big contrasts are set up. And the next several chapters will be about medieval civilization, but they're all going to build off of what happens here in chapter 5. In paragraph 10, the paragraph that we're in, which we talked about last week and the week before, and this week, we are exploring this paragraph is really looking closely at the corruption in Rome, at the way that Rome was not a fulfillment in a sense of fulfilling a promise of the ancient epoch of civilization, but it was a betrayal of that promise. It was corruption, and the corruption was the particular form of corruption that the ancient worldview and way of life was vulnerable to. So last week, I hijacked a call for a good hour and 15 minutes and downloaded. I tried to summarize 8 weeks of work that we did last year on the ancient psychology of human beings and how character works and how it fits into the larger framework. So that when we read these ancient authors, we assume that they see the world more or less the way we do, maybe in a more ignorant or primitive mode, but certainly they don't. We can't imagine that they've got deep insights that we're missing, that are absent, because we conceive of history as moderns, we conceive of it as a great march of progress. So we must see more than they see, right? And we must see better than they see. The idea that worldviews don't work that way, that the way worldviews work is they see from different angles. So each worldview sees some things that other worldviews can't see. And it also fails to see some things that other worldviews can see. It's got strengths and weaknesses. And that applies not just to the past and other epochs and other worldviews, it applies to us as well. We've got blind spots and we don't know where they are. This is the premise of the book. And Kenneth Smith says one way to begin to buy into this idea and to start dedicating your life to the work that's required to figure out where your blind spots are is to spend some time really immersing yourself in at least a couple other worldviews so that you can have the experience of being able to easily talk about things.
Okay, this is lacunae, isn't it?
This is lacunae. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
talking about lacunae. Gaps. Look, the term lacunae was coined with, I think, probably in biblical studies and classical literature studies for where a manuscript is missing something. And it's missing something because you've got another copy of the manuscript that isn't missing that. And sometimes you can tell it's missing because there's a tear or a blot or something that obscures part of the text. And so the study of what's missing has to do with these lacunae, or these gaps. So worldviews have lacunae too. And Kenneth's argument is that these lacunae are not just random little spots. They're not mistakes. They are characteristic of the worldview that you have. It is the very nature, its lawfulness, the structure of your worldview means that it must see certain things well, and it must see other things poorly, and that the two are related to each other because of the way that the worldview is structured. How does it imagine a human being to be? How does it imagine nature? How does it imagine the sacred? Once it's put these imaginings together and fused them together into a coherent worldview, the result is something that you can't see around very easily unless you can get out of it entirely and come at reality from another angle. So in chapter 10, paragraph 10 of chapter 5, what we're looking at is we're looking at we're looking at what did the newly emerging medieval civilization, what was its beef with the ancient world order as exemplified by Imperial Rome? What was its critique? What did it see as the problems? And that was why we spent last week looking at this ancient model of character and psychology and how it all works. Because all of these patristic Christian writers who were critiquing the ancient worldview and saying we've got something better, they were raised in this, right? Greco-Roman culture, Hellenistic culture, was all over the Middle East before Rome even came there. There's some discussion about how Hellenized the Jews were, say a century before Christ. How many of them spoke Greek and did not speak Hebrew at all. And there are writings from that, I'm sure Ari can point us to some. There are writings from that era where there are Jewish scholars and rabbis who are really wrestling with the problem of what are we missing in our own holy works, because only some of us speak Hebrew and many of us only speak Greek. So this is the milieu into which the Romans come in and impose Latin, right? They come a conquering, right? As is their way. They don't have any other way. That's their one trick ponies. They come in and they impose Latin all over everything. So now you've got Greco-Latin layered on top of Hebrew. So the point of this is these patristic writers are, these early Christian writers, they're coming out of a Jewish background, but they're coming out of a Hellenized, Latinized Jewish background, which prepares them to be able to have these debates with Roman and Greek scholars. And they're in a position to be able to speak the language of the people that they're arguing with, to think in the framework of the people that they're arguing with. They've got a foot in both worlds, kind of, so so when they talk about character, when they talk about freedom, when they talk about, the spirit, they are doing something like what we're doing in this seminar. They're doing a very difficult thing. And we don't tend to read them this way, but we should. They are using these words in one sentence or in one aspect. They're using them in the way that the Romans and the Greeks used them, at least as of the late Roman Empire. But in the same breath sometimes, and sometimes in the next breath, they're using the exact same words from the new framework that they're trying to create. They're consciously redefining the critical terms: soul, spirit, man, nature, God, all of these things. They're redefining them. And so they're having to, step back and forth between the two ponds, the two worlds, the two frameworks in making their arguments. So we know that because they told us they were doing it. We know it because Latin studies to this day identify patristic Latin as a dialect of Latin. It's distinct, it's identifiable, distinguished from Vulgar Latin, distinguished from late Latin, and distinguished from the Proto-Romance languages that follow. So this stuff that comes that F.M. Cornford points us to in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, and that he points us to in Aeschylus's Agamemnon and in the other tragic works, where he's saying the Greeks have this sophisticated model of human character. And it's their model of human character is like phusis. It's a flow, it's a lawfulness, it's a nature that unfolds according to its own inner laws of development. It's teleology. And as such, it is strong against some things and weak against other things. It is able to maintain itself in the face of certain kinds of pressures and be a coherent whole character. And in the face of other pressures, it changes. It can't help but be altered. And we talked about this last week when we talked about philoctos versus aphiloctos, on guard versus not on guard. That's one aspect, dealing with the negative. And dealing with the positive, you could say it's also an aspect of symathesy or a failure of symathesy. Are you alive to what's happening around you enough that your character will adapt, will learn, and will shift and grow? Or have you made yourself so rigid or self-blind or blind to the world that in the face of new information and new evidence, you fail to change, you fail to grow. And so you're more like a stone than like a living thing. And both of these dimensions, how do you react to the bad pressures that would wreck your character versus how do you react to the good pressures that would grow your character. These are both aspects that help to, from moment to moment in your life, that help to mediate the dance between agency and contingency and who you become over time and how you make your choices and how you act. The last part I want to take us to before we go on is where we left last week was with this concept of xuntukia, which are the it's a pair of conditions that if a human being is in that condition, they are placed under what the ancient Greeks understood to be untenable pressures on their character, not the normal kinds of pressures, but distorting pressures, damaging pressures that will wreck your character. And one of them they identified as penia, which is grinding poverty, which is not having enough to eat, starving. You can't you can't take care of your kids, you can't get health care, you can't get education, you don't have housing. It's not just poverty. It's the kind of poverty that's all consuming, where if you take your eye off the ball, you're just going to die. So you have to stay focused on what do I have to do minute to minute to survive. They say that wrecks character. It puts you under pressures that human character was never designed to handle. But they say equally bad is plotos, which is licentious wealth, extreme levels of wealth, where you never have to learn from your mistakes. You just keep throwing money at problems. And it makes, this is what Nietzsche's talking about when he says power makes stupid. You know, if when you are in a condition of plotos, your character is atrophying because you have shut down samathacy. You've shut down the need that a normal human being has, whether rich or poor. A normal human being has a need to pay attention to what's going around them and to grow their character to be able to handle the circumstances, right? We learn by doing. But if you have licentious wealth, you stop doing and other people do for you. All you do is give orders. And you become insulated from the consequences of your actions. And when that happens, it makes you stupid. And that level of stupidity leads to, and we didn't talk about this last week, but plotos leads to a certain set of daimones that can infect you and they wreck your character in specific ways. Likewise, penia leads to certain daimones that you're vulnerable to and that can wreck your character in a different set of ways. We'll talk a little bit about that stuff, but that was where we left off, is looking at this structure, because this structure is the basis of all ancient Greek storytelling. Whether it's an epic or a tragedy or a comedy, it's all assuming this framework. And then they're bringing characters in, and one of the first things the audience is looking for is, do they have a normal, healthy economic situation, or are they stretched past the breaking point on one end or the other? And if so, the audience sees something that the rest of us miss. They see, oh no, I know where this is going, because they know the rest of the story and we've never been introduced to it. This framework, this way of modeling character. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, as you were speaking, I was thinking, and Donald could help me out on that. The transition from suke to logos. It seems like that's a transition from sensing to knowing. And that, to me, comes about with language. A first spoken language still, I think, has the suke, but it seems to me written language writes it down and you have an objectification of that. So the relationship between subject and object then creates a parallel universe of the mind and the being. I mean, to the degree that we begin more and more to believe that the language actually contains the hidden message rather than the sensing of being has the capability of unfolding possibilities. I mean, to the degree, and I puzzle at this, because I'm not a scholar of Derrida, but it just seems to me he finds that the difference is within the language itself. You could just forget about being in the world, just criticize how the language is transforming our understanding and what is missing. The missing part, it really comes down to when I was when I'm still studying Heidegger is the relationship between asking questions like the whatness of something to the thatness. Oh, that's what it is. We got it pinned down. We know what it is, instead of like a question like, what the hell are we dealing with? We're not quite sure. We're not so certain. So that the uncertainty allows it to unfold rather than, oh, we only got to nail down. We could forget about the whatness and all that. So it comes down to the difference between question and answers. And that reflects me back when I was studying Chinese. Like I forgot my Chinese. I was unfortunately studying Mandarin. And the guy that taught, he was explaining the uh, the, the the different kind of sentences, the exclamatory, the declaratory, and the uh, uh, what is it? The question, the
Interrogatory.
interrogatory. But he pronounced it wrong. He says the interrogative rather than interrogative, and I almost raised my hand and wanted to correct him, but then I said, well, maybe he's right. We are interrogating nature rather than questioning it, right? Like shine a light. Isn't that what? Isn't that what one of the Bacons? Is it Francis Bacon who says we will put nature in a rack and pin and torture it until it divulges a secret, right? The interrogative. So the interrogative it become the declarative or exclamatory. So
Yeah.
that was interesting. So that transformation of the word interrogative has become interrogative.
Yes.
Tell me where you were last night.
Yeah, you introduced Derrida frequently, and finally I'm starting to catch up a little bit because my wife is taking a class on Derrida. So
Ah,
we watched a documentary about him, and we're starting to read about him and catch up. So his whole thing seem part of what he calls deconstruction seems closely related. Even though Kenneth might not be pleased that I'm going to say this, it might be closely related to the project that Kenneth is after in this book, which is to look at your context, to stop treating the text as though it is an absolute act of communication, and to recognize that the context, the worldview that we bring to bear, when we write or read a text, can so transform it that the writer and the reader can be thinking that they're having a conversation when they're actually, it might as well be a Rorschach test. They're
well, my question is, even if you understand this as a constraining factor to, in a sense, sensing and being in the world, are we trapped by that? Because we all think and use language as such a part of us. It's almost as if we can hardly think without language, or at least express our questions in language. So we're all under this derivative world that's become much more real than the real world. So I'll leave it at that. I just thought you're saying what I thought I was saying, but maybe not. By the way, they discover some archaeologists have discovered that symbolic language happened a lot earlier. The cave paintings that they have, they found some kind of abstract signs, and they think that that was the beginning of symbolic language, which is interesting, right? Not representational language. All right, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I have to drop off for a second because my wife is trying to study, and our cats have evidently made off with the highlighter. They thought it was a great cat toy and have been rolling it around. So I need to turn off my video and audio for a moment and go drag it out from under the piano or wherever it got to. So I'm going to turn this back over to somebody else to speak. So somebody come off mute and continue the conversation. I'll be right back.
Retail scenes. I think my question got forgotten there. It's usage of the word retail sins. Yeah, it was in the last paragraph of the number 9, I think. So retail sins.
I'm back. Yes, retail sins.
I've heard of retail banks.
Yes. Yes. So part of what he's alluding to there is that this is you're quoting from the part of the paragraph that's where Kenneth does that thing he sometimes does, where he transitions out of his topic and into a opportunistic critique of modernity, a kind of drive-by swipe at the modern worldview. And so he's taking a drive-by swipe at modernized forms of religion where it's just an extension of the market. People feel like they should be religious. They want to be religious, but it's all subordinated to the economy. And so the religion stops critiquing things like whether the people in power deserve to be there and starts critiquing things like, did you masturbate at night? And it does that stuff in part so that it doesn't get in trouble by challenging the dominant power in the world, because that would get it snuffed out. But his critique is that it is it's immoral if there are major systemic problems that are crushing billions of people. It's immoral to never speak about that and instead hyper focus on what people do with their hoo-has and wah-wahs. It's like, that's like extra credit. Once you get the basic stuff right, like, you don't have any slavery, then you can focus on issues like, did you get all of the little details, right? That's the crossing the T's and dotting the I's part of morality. And this is what he's doing with his retail versus wholesale here. He's talking about one of the ways that you can see the difference between religion in the medieval framework and religion in the modern framework is that religion in the medieval framework led to the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires. I mean, it was the powerful force, and politics and the economy were subordinated to it. But in the modern world, it's flipped around the other way, and religion's a player, but it's not. It's not. You're not going to see a Joan of Arc today rise up and.
Okay, but slavery wasn't a sin in the Bible.
Yeah, well, it depends on how you read it. For example, Ari was telling us about the Jubilee week before last, as I recall. Maybe it was last week. And we were talking about the framework. Oh yeah, Ari, come off mute and tell us what.
Oh yeah, so slavery is a really interesting topic. There's a lot of discussion I've had on this. Long story short, it's kind of like not unlike the relationships to children or women that I think it's called patria potesta in Latin, where a father owns his family, and that humans at this point are seen as objects in a family household. Women are like this, children are like this, to the point where a father can kill and he's not objected. Like he can such a in the larger, broader world of the ancient world, there's child sacrifice is relatively common, and that women are also similarly subject to their husband's law. And the way that the ancient Bible is theoretically, at least literally written, it seems to validate these things. But according to the oral traditions, and definitely the rabbinic traditions that talk about this, it's specifically a protest against this idea of human beings being owned, and that there is these modern ideas of written contracts, or for instance, like giving a piece of property to a woman, usually a ring that signifies that she has something like human rights. And also that the binding of Isaac is if you're familiar with that, this is where Isaac is put on an altar to be like sacrificed, like a child sacrifice.
Okay, there's nothing succinct in all that.
Not yet, right? What do you mean? Like I'm not making a point? There's nothing coherent yet?
Well, you're sort of creating a story, but it doesn't actually really address the question.
So the way that the Bible addresses things is through stories. That's kind of the way it works. Everything's a narrative, and the point is that through interpretation of these stories, you see that, like for instance, the rabbinic message of the binding of Isaac is that parents don't own their children; God owns them, and that as soon as Abraham was willing to give over his son to God, then God called the whole trial off. That's the interpretation of it on the subtext, but on the regular text, it's much looked at as child abuse. And similarly, this is the idea of what's going on with slaves. There's I don't know the specific portion of the Hebrew Bible that talks about this, but it basically talks about a slave, a Jewish slave or a non-Jewish slave, that you can only own them for 7 years. So slavery in the biblical world, according to the Jewish position, is that it's actually much more like indentured servitude. And specifically, the rules for how you treat your slave are such that you have to feed them before you feed
Okay,
yourself.
fair enough, but I think non-Jewish slaves could be held permanently as property.
So the idea is that the non-Jewish slave is also given the opportunity to become Jewish if so they so desire, and they can enter into this idea that they're not permanently owned. I mean, again, this is from a rabbinic, a Jewish position. I'm not sure how Christianity wants to interpret these texts, but from the tradition that we seem to follow.
Okay, there's a strong tradition. There's a difference between chattel slavery and indentured servitude. Certainly, there's a lot of difference about that.
But the point, it's more like the default is that you're an indentured servitude for 7 years, and that if the slave person so desires doesn't want to be released from servitude, wants to stay in the household, then you put like a special earring called an awl in their ear, and this gives them the status of being a slave for life. But the point is, this is not done by the owner. This is done by the owned. If the indentured servitude wants to go free, then the default is after 7 years, they're automatically released. And even apparently that any slave after the 50-year period, everyone is released. But to some degree, the idea is a servant is more like an employee in a household where they're fed, they're given.
Well, certainly this differentiation stands strongly. We know the difference between
there's more of a moral or philosophical point of view here. The point I'm trying to make is that the obligation on terms of your own wealth is that you have to provide for the slave before yourself. Meaning, if you only have one meal, you have to feed the slave before you feed yourself. If you only have one item of clothing, that has to go to the slave instead of you. And that similarly, all of the obligations of taking care of their well-being is, if there's a question of yours or theirs, it means theirs. You have an obligation of taking care of their. It's almost like if you're in a company, you have to pay their paycheck before you pay your paycheck.
And do I believe this?
So you don't have to believe that. This is just the tradition. This is, again, but these are according to the laws of how the slaves were treated in the I don't know, the ancient Jewish tradition of when they were a nation. And specifically, it's argued that this is specifically a protest to the way slavery was, especially then the whole narrative is that you were a slave in a strange land in Egypt, and that the whole point of that is to remember to treat the stranger as yourself, because you were a stranger in a strange land. And so again, the narrative is that it's a protest against these forms of behavior, and that society should develop to where they don't do this anymore, but it's more like a compromise between what is and what ought to be. And the same thing is similar, like the idea of a king for a nation. When the Jewish people are supposed to, or the Hebrews are supposed to go into the land, there's this whole weird thing about whether there's a king, and it's like the people are asking permission if they could have a king like the other nations. And the whole point is, well, like
I think we've got to a program to follow. I was simply just asking a question about
Well, I
some.
wanted to give a context to the
Well, you
whole
know, I can't
idea.
spend an excessive amount of time on questions away from the text, I suppose.
It's interesting. I'm feeling a bit of hostility from you, Stephen, unlike
No,
unusually.
it's not hostility. It's I get the feeling you're sort of going on about a lot of stuff which you could spend hours on.
Right, but we were asking about the nature of a
I've gotten the
slave.
gist of it. I'll let my little cogs see if it doesn't get lost in there.
You're saying you want to think about what Ari said so far. You don't want to.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's a very long argument. Very
Yeah, well,
long.
that's kind of like you asked me how a computer worked if you're an Aborigine. I can't just say it's data in, data out. I have to tell you about logic circuits and other things to some degree to make it
No,
robust
no,
and
no.
actually.
Let's not get into the logic circuits.
Right. So, okay, so fine. But the point is that and again, a simple answer to this is slavery is not a standard acceptable thing. And if there was a slave, it was a more like an employee in a household
Yeah.
with a lot of legal protections where the obligations are to take care of them before you take care of yourself.
Okay. Thank you for that, Ari.
Thank you, Ari.
I appreciate it. And thanks for the question, Stephen. As this was illuminating, and it sort of underscores a point that Kenneth and others have made about the Greek world, which is that it's very dangerous to generalize with terms like slave, because it all depends on, well, where and when are we talking about? So there are widely different approaches to slavery in the ancient world, and some of them are so different from each other, it's astonishing they're called by the same word. In fact, they weren't, right? Because the Hebrews use a Hebrew word for slave, and the Greeks use a Greek word for slave, and that should clue us in that we're talking about two different things, but we instead tend to try to apply a uniform, simple caricature across the whole spectrum. This is an epoch in which there is an astonishing diversity of political economies in the world. It's interesting because if you study Marxist-Leninist critiques of history, they lump in all of the slave societies together as their slave societies, and that's one of the places in the modern world where people get the reflex to assume that it's the same everywhere, because after all, that's how it's taught that way in MLEP, the Marxist-Leninist Education Project. But the problem with that is the more you learn about the ancient world, the more you discover each of these cultures is very different from each other. They're so different that we really shouldn't be generalizing and using the same terms for all of these different conditions. Anyway, thanks for that, Ari. That really helped to illuminate how different it is from, say, Sparta, where slaves were such objects that it was from time to time the slave owners would just go out and kill a few just to remind them that they're nothing and that the owners are everything. There's a wide difference between these approaches. So we bring this up because grinding poverty versus licentious wealth, right? This is the setup that leads into this week. Ari had wanted to do some more discussion of Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm getting there. We're going to do that today. There's just a couple steps to do to get there, and these are the last couple of steps to prepare us. The first one, I mentioned that the problem they saw with Penia and Plotos is that they damage your character in such a way that they make you vulnerable to specific vices. These are the specific vices. Those who suffer from Penia are so desperate that that it makes people daring. They will try crazy shit just because their circumstances are so bad that they feel like if it fails, it can't be worse than their life already is. If you make somebody's life so bad that they have nothing to lose, they become a very scary person. And there's Hollywood movies about that. You shouldn't have taken everything from me because now I'm the scariest person there is. I have nothing to lose. And the Greeks agreed with that. They called it tolma, which means daring. And the specific form of daring is dangerous daring, like reckless, crazy, failure is an option. It's okay if this wrecks everything, because after all, my current life is already a wreck. It can't be worse. And then likewise, probably you haven't heard the term tolma before, but the vices that spring from Plotos, you've probably heard at least two of them. Pleonexia, covetousness, is talked about a lot. and that is the desire to have other people's stuff. And in the modern world, we say, well, that's a crime issue. That's poor people want other people's stuff. But the Greeks said, no, no, it's people who have too much power who start thinking that the laws of ownership don't apply to them. They have so much power that, you know, your stuff could be their stuff as far as they're concerned. I mean, how are you going to stop them? They have so much money. They have so many people who could fight for them. They'll just come and take it. It makes people start to become acquisitive in a new kind of way in which they fail to recognize the rights of others. The second one, which almost everybody has heard, is hubris, or hubris. And interestingly, Cornford and Thucydides and Agamemnon don't translate hubris as pride, which is what I had always been taught before I read Thucydides' Mythhistoricus. Hubris is pride, hubris is pride, hubris is pride. And Cornford says, no, no, phronema is pride. Hubris is insolence. That is, you start to think you're so big that the sacred limits don't apply to you anymore, right? The commandments don't apply to you anymore. The things that thou shalt not do, because if you do those things, it will wreck everything. If you have enough, you know, kind of insatiable levels of wealth, you start to think that those limits don't apply to you, and you not only offend nature and the gods, you offend everybody around you, because they're all busy still trying to stay within the limits that beyond which thou shalt not go, right? Because that's, for most people, the basis of civilization, that there are certain things that are just not done. And so when the people with incredible levels of wealth start to think it doesn't apply to them, they start to do those things, and they in addition to whatever pushback they get from nature and the gods, they also get pushback from their fellow human beings, who start to think, I see the problem in our lives today, and I think it's you, because you're doing the things that none of us should ever do. Hubris, right? Insolence, and then phronema. So an example of this is the film Chinatown. Chinatown is a film about corruption, and it's a film about corruption in California. It involves, you know, the water laws and so forth, and which is kind of the major sources of corruption in California. And it involves a character who's behind the scenes most of the film, who is basically so rich he can have whatever he wants, and what he wants is incest with his own daughter and his own granddaughter. He's like, nobody can stop me. I can do anything I want. I'm so rich and powerful. Not just the laws don't apply to me, but the sacred things don't apply to me either. Like that we don't commit incest. He's like, you can't stop me. I'll just buy and sell police departments. I'll buy and sell whatever I need to get whatever I want. And it's portrayed as it's a very Greek conception that these are the consequences of too much wealth. So from the Greek perspective, the reason that you shouldn't have extremes of poverty and wealth isn't just because they're bad or God wouldn't like it or it makes people upset. They believe it wrecks your character in very specific ways. And once your character is wrecked in those ways, you are now vulnerable to doing astonishingly bad things. We'll talk about those in a sec. But first, Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, yeah. I mostly want to ask a question about hubris. I was thinking, it's interesting. I was taught that hubris is arrogance, and I'm wondering if that's different than insolence. Because again, I actually don't have a very good intuitive understanding of insolence. I do for arrogance, someone who thinks, and I was wondering, I feel like it's related. Again, this is an intuitive argument, not really a rational argument, that arrogance is something about, well, I'm so smart that I know better, and therefore the laws don't apply to me because those are for regular people who just don't understand how things really work. But because I know everything, I don't need those petty laws. They're for small people who just are small minded, but I'm so big minded that they don't apply to me. And this is an idea of not just like the laws are crappy, because it's not like the laws are bad, it's just I'm so special. And I'm curious if this is on the right track, or if this is different than insolence, or even I'm misunderstanding arrogance. Someone who's just like, I'm so smart, I can do, these laws don't apply. I mean, I would like, I don't know if anybody else is interested, but I was thinking it's worth investigating from a modern English perspective, how to break
Yes.
these ideas down into more of a robust representation rather than just some sort of misconception.
Yes, it's a great question. And it goes to the heart of what I didn't have right about this until I read Cornford's book. So what you're calling arrogance is what Cornford says the Greeks would call pride, phronema. When you think you're better than other people, and not just that you're better than other people, but because you're better than other people, the laws don't apply to you. Etiquette doesn't apply to you. The basic rules of society don't apply to you. That's phronema. That's when you're violating the human law, what the Greeks called nomos, the human law. But hubris, insolence, which is a word that in the modern sense doesn't have a clear meaning, and we'll see why it doesn't have a clear meaning in the modern sense in a moment. But to the ancients, insolence is when you think it's not just the laws of men that don't apply to you, it's the laws of the gods. It's the sacred laws, the laws that no one should violate, the laws that aren't different from one society to the next. They're built into the framework of the cosmos. They're part of the laws of nature. And you think those don't apply to you. So if you read a lot of Greek myths, you'll see from time to time myths of mortals who had such close relationships to the gods that they might dine with them or party with them or hang out with them. And then they overreach. They go too far and do what the gods have said you must not do. And then something horrific happens. Tantalus is one of those characters. I think Tantalus fed his children to the gods without telling them what he was doing. And the gods absolutely were against cannibalism. They didn't want to eat mortals. And when they found out, they were horrified, and Tantalus ends up in Hades being tortured for all eternity. This concept of there are things you can do that are so bad that the gods revolts, nature revolts, everything.
Wait, just to clarify, that example you just said, is that an example of pride or insolence?
So pride is when you violate human laws, and insolence is when you violate divine law, sacred law. So, worshiping the golden calf might be an example of insolence. Whereas, thinking that it's okay for me to take your stuff because you can't stop me is an example of pride or arrogance, you might say. So
could we simplify it like offending the gods is insolence and offending man is pride? Is that kind of like?
Well, we can call it offending, but the problem with calling it offending is that's more of I'm going to use the hideous term Judeo-Christian.
Yeah,
I
sure.
reckon Jewish is different.
Yeah, I'm stuck in these concepts. But no, just your example you said about feeding them to the gods. That's when they upset the gods. That sounds like it's upsetting the gods' laws, not human laws, right? And this sort's insolence, right?
Right.
Okay.
And to the Greeks, the idea is that the gods' laws are not arbitrary. They're not that way because the gods wanted them to be that way. They're that way because that's how the cosmos works. And the gods are just manifestations of parts of nature. So when you violate Zeus's law, it's not that Zeus gave you a command that you should do what he says and you broke it and now he's angry. That's a Christian idea or a Jewish idea or a Muslim idea, that gods decide what the laws are. The ancient idea is that the laws are intrinsic to the cosmos. They're built right into the cosmos, and all the gods are doing are they're putting it into words, but they didn't choose that law. You're not angering the god per se, although it's often written that way in the myths, in modern translations. It's not that you offended them by not obeying them. It's that you have set yourself against the cosmos. And the god, of course, notices because what you violated is the part of the cosmos that god is an anthropomorphization of. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and it doesn't from a locked into the modern perspective. It sounds as silly as I'm trying to break the law of entropy. Like that's something you can't. It just exists as this. I can't go against entropy. I can't go against gravity. Like that doesn't even. I can't even conceive of like a perspective. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. But it sounds like if I'm going against the rules of the cosmos, the rules we have of the cosmos now are like physics and stuff. You can't break those laws. Like that doesn't make any sense.
Yes, the Greeks would say that the laws of the cosmos include more than the laws of physics, but they include laws of hospitality. They include laws of how people are to treat one another, that there should not be any cannibalism, that they extend into these realms that modern conceptions of science don't include in nature.
Like you're talking about a moral aspect to a natural order, as opposed to just a physical aspect of natural order.
Yeah, and they believe that those laws against cannibalism or treating guests badly or so on, they believe that those laws weren't social conventions, that it's not possible to have a civilization, for example, if your culture collapses if those laws are violated. And it doesn't collapse for some random reason or because people are angry. It collapses because the laws of civilization are part of the laws of nature, not the laws that people pass, but the laws underneath them, that whether people pass them or not, those are the prerequisites for it to even be possible for people to relate to each other well. So their conception of nature reaches more into the human world than our conception of nature does.
I think this becomes very clear. Like I'm understanding this in terms of like the things that underpin society. And if you go against those, you're going to like actually destabilize society itself because it's based on these rules.
Yeah, yeah. That there's the rules under the rules. There's the rules that people make, like nomos, and then there are the rules under that it's just that you don't see how it's possible to even have a civilization, regardless of its laws, if you break those rules. So there's a satyr play about Polyphemus, the Cyclops who kidnaps Odysseus's crew, and it's a satyr play because it's a quote comedy. It's Greek concepts of comedy were pretty dark, and it is about Polyphemus as a character and why he thinks it's okay to eat people. And what becomes clear is that he is an embodiment of insolence, because the law against eating each other is not a human law from the Greek perspective. It's a natural law, which means it's a sacred law, and violating it is insolence. You say, I don't have to respect your humanity. I don't have to respect your agency. I'll just consume you. I'll treat you like a resource. And the Greeks would say, even if a civilization has failed to make a law against that, there's no nomos against it, it still violates the logos, the natural law. And, violating that is an example of hubris. So they separate these things. And it makes sense that in the modern world we have trouble with this because we discount the possibility that there is anything sacred. That there can't be a category of sacred laws. So for us, we map sacred law back onto human law and say, well, religions pass certain kinds of human laws, and we call those sacred laws. And the Greeks would say, no, it doesn't matter if somebody passed it or didn't pass it. Those laws are deeper than the laws that people pass. So they've got a whole category that we're missing. So for us, insolence and pride collapse into each other because of the sort of flat land that we've created where only human beings have any meaning and God and nature don't. Phil, come on.
I have a point to make on this that I want to talk about later. Because it's really interesting when you have the Judeo-Christian filter that we now have.
Sorry, you were digitized a bunch there, so I couldn't quite work out what you were saying.
Oh, I was just saying I thought I had a good point about how we nowadays have a totally different conception of this based on something that happens in this Christian era. And it was like a bit of a light bulb for me that I'd like to share later after other people get a chance to share it and stuff.
Oh, cool. Yeah, hang on, don't lose that. That's important. And it's important to characterizing, the transition from the ancient world to the medieval world to the modern world. This we've said before, right? The key loaded terms, the most important loaded terms in a language all get redefined on these transitions from one epoch to another. The word pride means something completely, arrogance means something completely different now than it did in the medieval epoch. And in the medieval epoch, it meant something completely different from what it meant in the ancient epoch. And you see it more clearly with a word like insolence that almost is undefinable in the modern world. It's hard to say what it might be because we've completely lost that dimension of life that used to be so important to the ancients. To them, it's a make or break deal, insolence. And to us, we can hardly even say what it is. So Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, to follow what you say about, I guess, insolence and arrogance or pride, I have two questions. One is not only individual, right? It could apply to a whole society. I mean, like I'm thinking of Geist and Zeitgeist, right? I mean, the whole society could have Zeitgeist, the spirit of a time rather than just guys. So if that's the case, it seems like when the Persians, when Xerxes attacked the Greeks, that was not just arrogance, that was insolence. And when Athens wanted to become an empire in a way, is that just simply arrogance rather than insolence? Because it didn't want to cannibalize the other city states. It just wanted to bring it under its control. Is that a major difference? Because they didn't quite go as far as like violating the laws of the gods. I don't know.
Yeah.
And the third question, and this is not a question, it's a statement. One of the things I have to say about insolence is that, if that's true, is that, I'm a very committed humanist. And at one meeting, I was telling, despite the fact that I'm very much a humanist, it seems like the human race as a race, it's a collective, in other words, more than just a single individual. There's something wrong with it. I might now call it insolence because, like, it's completely destroyed nature. It has no concern about nature, right? Look, we destroyed the woods. Like I said, nowadays, all you could do if you think you're going to be a wild tiger, you have the choice to live in a zoo
Right.
or be dead. I mean, like, it's like that's not a very good choice. We're very, very insolent about being in relationship to the cosmos in that sense. I mean,
Yes.
so yeah,
Yeah.
that's one problem I have with humanism. I mean, I'm a committed humanist, but I see the fault in it, and I keep raising it up, and people don't like it when I raise it up, but it just seems very
Yes.
obvious. Okay, I'll leave it at that. That's more of a statement. That's not a
It's a
question.
great statement. And I want to run with it for a minute or two before I call on Stephen. One thing I want to say about it is you're right on. It's part of the reason that we don't understand insolence and can't quite figure out what it might be is that our entire civilization is based on insolence. That the idea that you dethrone God and make God something that, is a hobby or something you do on the weekends, and that human parliaments and markets will be the determiner of how we live, not the gods. And that if a religion wants to exist in the modern world, it has to exist within the cracks and crevices that are allowed for it by these parliaments and marketplaces. And if it violates that, it gets shut down. Right? That concept that nothing is sacred, that you're allowed to behave, because the definition of the sacred is that's the line beyond which you won't cross, right? It is the duties you must carry out, and it is the forbidden things you must not do, and why you must not do them or carry them out goes beyond human choice, right? It's either about, in the ancient conception, it's about that's the way nature works, and if you break it, nature doesn't work for you anymore. You're so far out of harmony that you wreck everything. Or the medieval conception is you've been given commandments. You have to obey those commandments. Insolence in the medieval perspective is disobedience, willful scoffing disobedience of the thing that you're supposed to do. So there's a change, but what they have in common is both the ancient and medieval worldviews respect the idea that there are things that people shouldn't be able to legislate away. Right? You shouldn't, to give a modern, we feel this intuitively, even though we can't quite explain it using modern languages. But an example is the International Human Rights Framework, that includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the legal frameworks that go with it. It says that, for example, even if a country passes a law saying that genocide is legal or obligatory, like Nazi Germany did, that law is inherently invalid because, and now in the modern world, they can't quite explain why that's true. You say, well, because it violates rights. And then it sort of peters out, it gets weak. But what the medievals or ancients would have said is because it violates sacred law, and sacred law trumps human law, and you're not allowed to make human laws that say it's okay to exterminate people. You're not allowed to pass a law that says it's okay to eat people. You're not allowed to pass a law. There are things that must not be so that civilization can be, and that human laws are not the ultimate arbiters of what is and isn't allowed. That human laws are supposed to work within the framework of nature and harmonize us to nature. But in the modern perspective, we don't recognize the authority of nature. And so we have difficulty explaining this stuff.
Well, our business world has turned nature into a standing reserve
Yes, yes,
to
exactly.
be exploited. That's it.
It's just a forest is just a stock of timber, right?
That's
Waiting
right.
to cut down. Exactly. That idea that if you cut down the sacred grove, the fates will send your own hounds to tear you to pieces. They'll turn you into a stag and you'll be ripped apart. We just laugh at that, say, haha, that's just a fairy tale. And then we can't explain global warming. It's sort of like we too violate these kinds of natural laws in an insolent way, and then we incur these catastrophic results, and then we treat it like it's a coincidence every single time it happens, right? It's like, who could have foreseen that? Well, anybody but a modern could have foreseen it. It's like there's things you don't do, and nobody had a problem with that until our epoch came along and said, we can do anything. We don't believe that there are any limits. We don't think that nature's binding upon us. We certainly don't think the gods are binding upon us. We shop around for which God we want. We pick our church. The ancients didn't believe you could do that. The medievals didn't believe you could do that. They didn't think that was a matter of choice. You couldn't just say, I choose not to believe in Zeus. Zeus was there whether you liked him or not. Because he's part of nature, right? It's like saying, I choose not to believe in gravity. Well, tough luck, you're going to fall anyway. This was the attitude towards religion, before the modern era. But now in the modern era, we have so demoted the sacred, including, the sacred in nature, that we think you can just choose to ignore whatever you feel like ignoring and get away with it. What could possibly go wrong? Everything's as simple as I want what I want and I do what I need to do to get what I want. That's it. That's the end of the picture. There's nothing means anything. It's just whether or not I can get what I want. And of course, that's what the film Chinatown says. Well, if that's all you've got, then you should expect to have incest and cannibalism and genocide, because that's what follows. Somebody somewhere always wants those things. And if, they can just get powerful enough and pass a law and make it happen because you don't have anything sacred, well, then you don't have a civilization either. You just have a big tug of war going on that you've mistaken for a civilization. And we are characterologically unfit to understand that message because of the way we've been acculturated, right? It's hard for us to conceive of anything beyond human law. It's a challenge. It's one of our blind spots. And you see it with insolence. And I think I want to reiterate another thing that we talked about, about 3 months ago, that we also don't understand, which is sophrosune. We always translate sophrosune as practical intelligence because we know to the Greeks it was the best form of mental height, some kind of great mental thing. And we can't imagine anything better than being really, really good at getting what you want. See, practical intelligence to us, that's as big as it gets. The idea that there could be something higher than that, and that higher thing is, do you want things that are healthy for you and your people and your species and your planet? Do you know which way health and vitality lie? And that's better and more important than practical intelligence. To us, that's almost inexpressible, which is why all the translators translate Aristotle and they make sophrosune be practical intelligence. Our blind spot is universal on this. So like we can't understand insolence, we also can't understand sophrosune. They just don't make sense to us. The flatland of the modern worldview has no place, has no third dimension that has to do with oughts and musts that go beyond what humans decide they ought and must. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Looking at the etymology, insolence is more than pride, in the sense it's particularly in a hierarchical structure. Now you get a really severe one, the imaginary hierarchy of the Lord and the Japanese samurai. Now, if a samurai gets so proud that he decides, I'm going to overthrow the Lord, apparently, according to our fictional understanding of the Japanese, that was the worst thing you could possibly do. absolutely the worst, was to become so proud that you're going to overthrow your lords, which happened quite a lot back in the 16th century, I believe. That was what it was all about, was overthrowing your lords. So their worst sin they indulged in, of course, but probably a great illustration is that all that stuff that was going on amongst the young Hegelians, where you had Feuerbach who finally says, it's a closed system, there is no God. I'm looking at the Bible now. Therefore, everything we owed to God is owed to man. Well, quite literally, his system was, this switch, which became played in the thought of the times, very interesting, where we only have to scrub out the word God and put man in its place everywhere. This is insolence par excellence. And of course, famously, Max Stirner said, well, why stop there? I can put, why are you enslaving me to the human herd? You're raising my own humanity, which I own now. We've gotten rid of God. I own my humanity. You're taking humanity, which is my property, and raising it as a God above me. How dare you? That's what Max Stirner said. So he just did the extra switch. Feuerbach switched from God to man as a generality, the human herd. And then Max Stirner said, oh, why not go further? I'll just put my ego there. He was actually having a bit of a joke. Stirner was very much about the selfish individual, but what he was sort of struggling with was the tendency that was in somebody like Feuerbach into absolutism. Stirner respected the point that he was an individual and he had a lot of individual interests, but he wasn't into absolutism. He didn't see himself as the absolute. He was simply doing that as an exercise. Hey, if you're going to wipe out God and put human in its place, let's wipe out human and just put me, the individual, in its place. So that's my question is, my point is insolence seems to be usurpation. You have a lord, there's a basis, there's a bonds between men.
Yes.
And if you pull the rug out from under that bond away, that's insolence. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. Insolence takes on these different meanings in these different epochs and circumstances as we lose the original conception of nature above the sacred, above the human. As layers peel away epoch by epoch, insolence gets demoted from being about violating, the sacred order of things to, disobeying God, to just disobeying some lord in some particular human society. It's if you fail to properly bow to the king or kiss the Pope's ring the right way, in the modern world you're called insolent. But of course,
I'm worried sometimes, Rick, that you might be violating the fact value barrier of Hume.
yes,
You've got to be careful when you say cannibalism is wicked.
yes,
That's simply a value. That's not a fact. I've heard from many cannibals that humans are absolutely delicious,
that's
except
right.
for white men who are a bit too salty.
That's right. And this is the critique that the ancients would have of the modern world. They say if you create a flat land, if you don't respect the natural hierarchies built into nature and the sacred, then what happens is sooner or later there's nothing that's off limits. You can do anything to each other. And we know where that leads. That's not even interesting. We've been there before on a small scale. The last thing in the world we want to see is what it looks like on a large scale. Well, moderns demonstrated it nevertheless. We get
Sodom and Gomorrah.
gulags, ecocide. We get all these things happening on a hugely horrific scale because when You don't believe in anything. When nothing has a value, then everything's up for grabs. You don't. Gil Scott Heron says, if you don't stand for something, you'll go for anything. And he's sort of paraphrasing.
This was the point that worried Nietzsche, wasn't it?
Yes, that's exactly the point that worried Nietzsche. I mean, it's ironic that people call Nietzsche a philosopher of nihilism, because what he was a philosopher who critiqued nihilism and said the problem with the modern order is it's nihilism. Nihilism's terrible. And here you've got the Nazis going, oh, he loves nihilism. I love nihilism. Nihilism's great. Like, oh, no, for the love of God, you turn my message inside out. So anyway, this is the this critique that Nietzsche has of the modern epoch, that by following up on the medieval world's usurpation of nature, by in turn usurping God, and saying now human parliaments and markets will decide everything, and there's no higher authority. There's nothing that's off limits. Everything is for sale. Everything can be done if you just have enough power. And we expect nothing anymore of the people who govern us. They can do anything that they want, that they can get away with, as long as they can manipulate the system to make it legal. Is it wrong to round up the Jews into extermination camps and kill them all? Well, other epochs had an easier time saying things were wrong. In the modern world, all we're reduced to is it legal? if it's illegal, then it's wrong to us. But if it's legal, then we say it's right and mandatory. And next thing you know, all the Germans are cooperating with rounding up all the Jews. Because after all, what is there other than human law? It's what we see in the Holocaust is the perfect expression of modernity. We see the things that are sacred, that must not be violated, being legislated away, and the things that we must not do being turned into an obligation, until to try to stop the Holocaust was illegal, and to perpetuate it was your legal duty. This is the nothingness at the heart of modernity, that there's no outside set of values or laws that can critique modern legislatures and markets and say, that's too far, you've gone too far, you must take a step back. So you can see that, and maybe Ari's about to mention it. You can see that in what Ari was saying about God has rules about what you can do and can't do with slaves, and how long you can keep a slave. And you don't violate those rules because they're sacred. They're sacred. Nobody should be a slave for their entire life. You only get them for so long, and then you have to let them go. And what that does is it helps to hem in the worst excesses of slavery. And when you add into it, if you don't have enough to go around, you have to feed your slave first. You have to clothe your slave first. If there's only enough food for one person to eat, it's not going to be you, the slave owner. It has to be the slave. Otherwise, you don't deserve to have a slave. You should be free, right? This is a sacred obligation to treat that person at least as well as you treat yourself. This hems in and limits what human legislatures and markets are allowed to do to try to prevent the worst excesses. And an epoch that recognizes some authority higher than the human is capable of doing that. Whether it's God, whether it's nature, whether it's something else. I mean, who knows how many epochs there have been in human history, how many worldviews. But there's at least these three. And we see that 2 out of the 3 didn't have this problem that modernity has, where in modernity anything goes. You can do anything. You don't believe in anything. I always think that the national theme song, the epoch-wide theme song for modernity is Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. Nothing really matters. Anyone can see. Nothing really matters to me. That's the refrain in Bohemian Rhapsody. The guy who goes too far and does what he shouldn't do. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to make at first a quick point. If I go too long, feel free to cut me off. I tend to be too wordy, so I need you guys' help to keep me in my place. Not being too insolent. No, in this case, just be prideful. That it would seem in the beginning there was natural in the beginning, ancient. I don't know if it's all at the beginning, but our starting point of this is there's natural law and there's human law, and then it would seem like the Christian epoch, similar with the Jewish tradition, does something and says, no, natural law and human law are actually under the category of God's law. They're all one category of sacred, and therefore to be, let's say, to steal from your fellow is not actually just breaking man's law. You're actually breaking God's law. And it seemed like you before you had two separate categories. Now everything is God's law, and then as that sort of gets corrupted through this epic, the medieval epic, there's this great, I would almost say Nietzsche says this morality that you've described, which is just a trick to keep herds in their place, and it's keeping people from actually embracing life, and therefore we're going to take all of these things away, and no longer there's no such thing as any God's law. It's all man's law. And so it would seem like this Hegelian process of, not that we have a synthesis yet, it's almost like an antithesis of an antithesis. I don't feel like a synthesis. I feel like a thesis is more like what Phil was saying, is now that we're imagining some more utopian society, which is hard to imagine, but a utopian society that has surmounted and fixed global warming, which I don't like that term. I like to think of it as just plain old environmental degradation. We've turned the natural world into a gas station. Right? But once we fix that and we return to this idea that there is some things in nature that are sacred and there's some sort of synthesis between natural law and man's law, that would go back to some version of what the ancients are. But clearly, it's because, seems to me clearly, because even in the Judeo-Christian world, the Jewish tradition seemed to have this problem, but was fixed or at least modified later on with the rabbinic law. Is there's two types of law in Jewish law. There's the what's called the Torah law, which is the Bible law, and then there's also rabbinic law. One is made by God, and the other one's was a territory was allowed to be made by man. And one is much worse than the other, especially when looking at punishments. One's by death, and the other's by whatever, right? But they're two different, very distinct categories. And it seems like this is what the modern epoch maybe stole back, is that everything was God's law under this. Like there was no man's law. And it makes sense. This really gets rejected. Of course, there's aspects of man's law. I mean, I can understand from what the original purpose was, which is maybe we're talking about here with Christianity, is the Torah law is this idea of rejecting of ananke, that if there's natural law, that's just fated. You can't do anything. It's tragic. And this idea, like, no, we believe in free will and that you can have a dialogue with these laws, and you can actually, I don't know, maybe get God to change his mind if you want to look at it that way, but also have a space where you can have free will. There's a measure of free will. And this idea that we want to just suspend natural law so that we can have free will gets overturned, that like, no, everything's God's law. And then the rejection of everything's God law is everything's man's law. And it seems like this is the humanist point that we're in now, where, well, if everything's man's law, well, humans can make anything they want the way they want, and you get to moral relativism of like postmodernism and all that stuff. But it's based. It seems like I never realized this, and thank you, Stephen, for pointing out this sort of like, I like the way you say, taking the rug out from under the Lord and subsuming his position. This is again about reordering the hierarchy, and the way you do this is by sneaking, or maybe it's not smuggling in the baggage, but just like changing the definition of what these laws are. Now you basically change the rules so you can do whatever you want within this new rule structure, so long as you're obeying the new rules. And I kind of, the last point I want to make is this idea of human law is, to me, the problem with too much democracy or too much populism is whatever's legal and whatever you want to do is fine so long as it's popular, right? If you want to talk about Nazism, the only thing that was stopping that was that maybe it's not popular enough. And if you got it to be popular, well, then you can do whatever you want. And this says no, that it's right now. You have nothing sacred. It's whatever men want it to be, and then men don't agree. They want to make systems of just what men are. And so I can see this sort of race to the bottom because of this, right? So yeah, that was more just one at the Hegelian. Interesting that how going to God's law turned us to too much God's law, turned us into too much man's law.
Yes. Yes. It follows directly, doesn't it? You know, the idea that we can just usurp a category of laws we don't like, which was an inescapable part of the medieval revolution. That sets up the idea of the end of the medieval epoch right at the beginning. It says, well, if that law can be thrown out, then so can the laws that I'm trying to introduce now. They can be thrown out too. We could just disregard whatever we feel like disregarding. You know, it's interesting, you know, the ways in which, I guess even as an adolescent, when I first started looking at the dialectic, one of the things that intrigued me was the idea that the whole good people are defeated from the outside by bad people, and that's how you lose, and that's the only way you lose. Seeing that that is a limited Hollywood style kind of flatland view of the world, and that more often than not, it's not the outsider who takes you down. It's your own success that takes you down, because your success contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. This idea that the systems we put in place are not perfect systems, and they don't just do the work we want them to do, but as a side effect of that, they grind away at themselves internally and destroy themselves from the inside. When I first kind of had the aha experience of realizing that really happens in the world, it just completely changed the way I looked at everything. And I feel like what you're talking about really summarizes how that applies to history and law. In a nutshell, you've just kind of captured 4,000 years of human history. So thanks, Ari. I'm always fond of that kind of, covering a huge amount of ground in a small space. Very well done. Geneva, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, so I don't know how simple-minded this is going to sound with all you minds in the meeting today, but I just wonder if it isn't insolence or pride for mankind to think that we could just destroy nature, and that nature, being organic in itself, doesn't have a response to what it is we're doing, so that it's not going to just stand by and let us destroy it. So whenever I hear people say this, it just makes me crazy, because I think nature isn't just going to stand by. I mean, I think of nature as maybe God, or that powerful being beyond who we are, who's basically in charge and pulling the strings, and not going to just stand by and let us destroy it without some response. It's organic too. So isn't it sort of, I don't know what's insolent or pride for us to even make those types of comments? I mean, I know that I'm a Hegelian, so I realize that it's an evolution. I can remember being a child and nobody gave a second thought to throwing their water bottle out the window, or cigarette butts or soda cans or whatever. We don't do that anymore. Now we have recycling. So we're evolving. I don't buy that we're going to destroy the forests and destroy all this stuff. I mean, we may deplete it to some extent, but it's not going to be the end. It kind of disturbs me whenever I hear that. And I think, is that not insolence or pride or something of mankind to think that we're just going to wipe out everything?
That's right.
We're not that powerful, I don't think. But I don't know, just a couple of things that I've been thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's brilliant. And core to that is the idea that, and this is a point Stephen frequently makes about rationality. The moderns are so hyper rational that we think we can't create a problem so bad that we can't fix it. Right? We think that we're so smart, and nature is so empty and so simple that it can't respond. It will just do what we want it to do, and there won't be any negative. The law of unintended consequences. Every time we set out to do something, we not only produce the results we want, we also produce results we didn't want. The law of unintended consequences is supposed to be a check on our fetish for rationality, to remind us that the universe is bigger than we are. It's more complex than we are. And as you say, Geneva, it responds. It doesn't just lie there letting us do whatever we want. It's a living system that responds. But you can see how sort of the Newtonian machine model of the cosmos doesn't prepare people to understand that what we're dealing with is aware of us in countless ways, and it responds to us in countless ways. It's not just an engine that we're tinkering with, it's a living organism on multiple levels. And it has its own teleology and interests and character that's unfolding separate from ours. and it's not just going to lie there and let us do what we want. So you're right. Hyper rationality of the kind that Stephen likes to critique, it is a form of insolence, and it's really central to the modern epoch. I mean, I think that's it in a nutshell, and it tells us something about the differences, some of the most important kind of emotional experiential differences between what it feels like to be a modern versus what it used to feel like to be a medieval, or what it used to feel like to be an ancient. They didn't have that kind of insolence that we have. They had other things. Not saying they were saints by any means, but this particular water we swim in is very modern water. This idea we can do anything we want without consequences. It's a great point. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, modernity is actively, trying to deal with this situation. We have the International Criminal Court. We have this Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man. We're trying to get all these divine laws into positive law. We are promoting these things just as fast as we can. That's kind of just proving that modernity doesn't believe there's anything above positive law. There is no natural law. So all of what was formerly natural law, if you're not going to share that, I'm going to stop talking. Anyway, yeah, that things that for earlier people would have been natural law, whether physis or God's law, they have to be dealt with now in terms of positive law. I mean, actually, World War II is the case, is that there wasn't really, and a lot of good lawyers argue that like the Nuremberg trials were without foundation because there wasn't any positive law that made what Nazi Germany did illegal under actual positive, and was it lack of imagination? We just never thought anybody would ever do such a thing. Or it certainly wasn't that we thought that somebody was going to step in and enforce a prior civilization's view of natural law for us. But, there's one other thing from earlier, this sympathecy that you talk about, this adaptive learning relationship. I think sometime I would like to hear you. To me, that sounds like a corrosive concept that undoes all of what we like to think of as our social sciences. That we're studying something we might as well be studying, I don't know, flowing water or the whirlwind or something that's constantly changing. Every time we think and this is also philosophical, every time we think we know ourselves in some way through these social sciences, we become different. That knowledge, if there is any knowledge in these things, changes us and makes the prior knowledge inapplicable. It's kind of the same thing. And then to extend this, why would some people on this one planet at the edge of one galaxy and a whole universe of billions think that their gods had anything to contribute to what was naturally or divinely correct? I mean, divine law would be just it would be our gods, and it would just be some parochial stuff from the edge of some middling galaxy in the middle of not even in the middle, just somewhere in this enormous universe. How could we offer, any obedience to these laws made by such piddling gods as these? So I'm gonna go back to sleep. Enjoy your cookie. I'm gonna see if my wife has any.
Sorry, man. I'd share it if I could. I could fax you a picture of it, I guess. Um, yeah, I mean, it's striking. I think people born today find it difficult to understand that moderns didn't discover the universe until the 20th century. And not only didn't we know the universe was a thing, we didn't even know a galaxy was a thing. We discovered the galaxy in the 20th century. And when we discovered it, we thought that was the sum total of everything. And the idea that not only is there a galaxy, there are so many galaxies you can't count them. The cosmos is vast beyond. This is all recent stuff, right? Our laws and philosophies and worldviews, our approach to the economy, all of these things are basically they're the equivalent of Stone Age technology. I mean, they're based on a conception of a really tiny cosmos in which Earth is really the important place.
Well, I'm glad you caught somewhat the irony of what I was saying.
Yeah, it is ironic that we would say what our little assemblies feel like deciding is binding upon all of that out there that we didn't even know existed, that we never could have even imagined. But it all has to obey us because we're in charge. It's insolence, right? Like Geneva says, the entire framework of modernity is insolence. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Can't theorize galaxies. The Mount Wilson telescope was powerful enough to resolve galactic nebula into individual stars. Whenever that occurred, what was that? That was around World War One or something like that. And then, oh, yeah, okay, we're on. But Kant did theorize galaxies prior to that. I'll just bring up the issue of man, as you pointed out, Hegel's man, God and nature, and I think it pays to remember it. Modern materialists will say there is only one thing, nature. Well, fair enough, that's a good argument, I like it. But theorising things, we can also say there is also the claim, how true it is I don't know, that it's because man is a self-conscious being, he can choose. He can make the choice. He can see what he conceives of the laws of nature and say, I'm going to turn them all upside down because I'm a self-conscious creature and I can do that. So we have these spheres. We have gods, which you might term as theism. We have nature, which is probably sort of self-explanatory, but it could use some explanation. Nature is what we draw all our materials out of. If I get some rocks, that rock is natural. If I make a wall out of it, that wall is artificial, but it's made out of natural materials. How man alters things is considered not being part of nature, of being above nature. That's the common conception. It might be wrong. Anthropomorphism is when man changes things in accordance with his own values. Now, this is a point again. We also, I believe in the supernatural. I don't believe in, say, the explicit claims of Christianity according to whatever doctrine came along and usurped the previous doctrines. You look at the history of Christianity and, well, they're saying one thing 1 minute and then they changed and said, this is the new rule. So, okay, I'll study it, but I don't know. But I'll just say that I believe in a supernatural, or possibly there's something divine. So for me, these are three aspects. There's the supernatural, there's the natural, and there's man as a creature all on their own. And I conceive of that way. See, I'd be wary of claiming that nature has values in the sense that the philosophers talk about values. nature contains facts, but can we make them values? That was Hume's big argument. We create abstract values which might have nothing to do with reality. This is what man, the special creature, sort of does. So I'm a bit worried about this tendency to think that a particular human set of values rules the universe. I'm a little bit wary of that one.
Yes.
I remember I was having an argument with Les of the Melbourne existentialists, and he was saying that the really great day would come when we can finally rid ourselves of religion, take away the cloths before our eyes of religion, and then we would see each other truly as we are. And I said, well, Les, you never know. Once you've taken away all the narratives, you might just simply find an empty space. You might delve down into your mind and find that movie theatre which is showing everything, but you'll find all the seats are empty. So this is my quandary. This is my big difficulty, that I like, or at times I've liked to think I'm smart. Then I learned I wasn't so smart. I realised that left to my own inner resources, I could come up with a set of beliefs and a set of values which turn out to be pretty lame, that could only be corrected by something external, whether it was natural or supernatural. And this is my problem with modern humanity and their humanism. It was Spengler claimed, I don't fully understand it, I noticed Ari came in on it, but the problem with humanism and the problem with man creating his own values is, well, Oswald Spengler said, well, they created the Enlightenment and then the Enlightenment proceeded to destroy the Enlightenment. This is what we're suffering from at the moment. So that's my question. Yeah, I like to think I'm smart, but put me in charge of the world. What a mess I could create. So I need the supernatural. I need the idea that there's something supernatural that can raise me above what I am, because I think as the human left purely to my own resources, I could only destroy all values, or I'd create something pretty lame. I'd create a pretty lame version of heaven. All right, people talk about a God. Maybe God can create the better heaven. But if it was left to me to create heaven, I'd probably create a very lame version of heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, and this is the ancient critique of what it means to be mortal. That there are many challenges we're up to, right? There's many things we can do. It's not that we're helpless, but if there are many things that we want to do and try to do that are way outside our wheelhouse, but we try to do them anyway. And you sort of wish that we had the kinds of limitations there are that prevent anybody from being an anesthesiologist until after they've developed the character and the training and the experience, right? Yes, that's where we're going, Sharon. It's like there are protections in place to ward off the many would-be anesthesiologists and only let the people who actually put in the time and effort to develop the character to make them less of a menace to the people around them. Those are the only people we allow to be actual anesthesiologists. And you sort of wish that we treated governance with like even half the level of care that we treat anesthesia. But instead, our only requirements is you're an American citizen of a certain age who hasn't been convicted of a felony yet. That's it. You can have every vice there is. You can want to be a cannibal who eats everyone. Everyone knows when you're elected, you're going to eat everybody you can. And You're still eligible for office. Sure, why not? This is modernity. We don't believe in anything. Anybody can. We don't think anything's sacred or important. Nothing really matters to us. So I'm going to call on everybody else, but first I'm going to put the last two. I said I had two more to go. The last two bits that gets us to the end of this Aeschylean structure to talk about character, so we can talk about Martin Luther King, what he has to say about character. So here's the next to last one. And this is one of the things that's very hard for us as moderns to read in the Greek myths and the Greek tragedies. And that's the idea that the Zeus, as described in the plays of Aeschylus, he uses the tragic passions as ministers of justice and agents of punishment. Now, how shall justice be done in the world? He says, well, it shall be done through human character. Human character is the medium of justice. When people of bad character get too much power, they shall wreck themselves. And Aeschylus has a specific sequence of events that will happen, that has to happen. And Sophocles and Euripides play with this too, that inevitably happens. It's like a systematic set of relationships between our character, agency and contingency, whether we are subject to Penia and Plautos. If we are, then the vices that we accrue inevitably as a result of that. And then that sets us up to temptation. We get tempted by the tragic passions. We get tempted into opening the doors and being unguarded against the tragic passions, which is when they take possession of us. And he gives examples of it here. He says, and these three terms in particular, apate, ate, and patho, are so important. Because patho, defined here as temptation, we've seen defined previously as persuasion. We've seen Aristotle say that patho is the whole framework of justice in Greek politics, that we don't try to win by beating you over the head with a stick. We try to win by persuading you. That the Greek city-states will be governed by people who debate and discuss, almost in a rabbinical fashion. They debate and they discuss and they chew over the meaning of the value system in the current circumstances, and they try to see if they can who can come up with the most persuasive arguments that can persuade all these highly educated, intelligent people. And then that's what the city-state's going to do. That's how Athenian democracy was supposed to work. But Cornford is saying that Thucydides and Agamemnon see patho as not just being a good thing, but also a bad thing. Because the same persuasion that can be used to temper individual characterological problems in a governance debate can also be the thing that leads you to destruction internally when you are persuaded internally to try something you shouldn't have tried, to reach for something you shouldn't have reached for, right? Something makes sense to you. It seems good to you. Doke moi, it seems to me. You're persuaded by things. Every rationalist uses the argument when they're talking about somebody else's argument. If it's a really intelligent argument and full of, it's got a lot of proof, it's got a lot of background, it's got a lot of persuasive, but they don't want to believe it. What the rationalist says is, I see that you've put a lot of work into this and I admire the work that you've put into it, but I remain unpersuaded. And they're trying to frame that as though that means that they're rational and objective. But the Greek perspective is no. It is the irrational parts of their own character. They're more persuaded by the ideologies they already hold than by the new ideas you're presenting them with. And that is an irrational process, not a rational one. It's driven by character. It's a characterological process. They are tempted by their ideology more than they're tempted by the new truth that you're revealing to them. So an entire generation of geologists could not believe in continental drift. It doesn't matter how you fit Africa and South America together, they couldn't believe it. You could look right at it, and they still weren't persuaded. They were more persuaded by the ideologies that they picked up in their university days, when they were given the arguments that felt so good to them about how everything is static and it doesn't move and it just holds still. That felt more persuasive. And Cornford says that Thucydides and Aeschylus and the rest say this same level of unconscious persuasion, patho, is what tempts people to overreach. It feels the same way as when you're turning down an argument you don't believe in. It doesn't feel convincing. and the other two that he points out, ate and apate. Apate is the word that we need for Kierkegaard's delusion, or for Kenneth's ideology. Apate is that thing that possesses us and makes us think according to its rules, and we feel like it's helping us because it's giving us rules to follow, to think, and therefore our thinking is disciplined and rigorous. But what it's actually doing is teaching us not to think. We're not risking anything. We're just following the rules of the ideology. It tells us this step leads to that step, which leads to that step. And we say, see, we're being diligent. We're connecting all the dots together. It's very tidy. It's very law-abiding, and therefore it must be true, we say, failing to understand that, out of every 100 logically sound arguments, 99 of them are nevertheless bullshit. They're valid, but they're false. Validity and truth are unrelated. They're orthogonal to each other. Unless your initial conditions are without any flaw anywhere, the logic that you build out of those conditions is going to multiply the errors until the conclusions you reach are false. And apate is the delusion that's not true. Apate is the faith that as long as you follow the laws of thinking, you will always lead a true result, which it isn't the case. So people are constantly logically persuading themselves to do things that are not healthy for them or other people, but they do them anyway because it's more persuasive. The delusion is more persuasive. And then ate. Ate is a critical daimon. It has two different definitions, and the one that you will often see on the internet or even Wikipedia is ruin. Ruin. Ate arrives in the tragedy after when at the moment when Oedipus realizes what he's done. At the moment when he realizes that I'm on top of the world, Ma, but no, actually, I'm the most cursed of all the Greeks. Everything I thought was great turns out to be awful. The guy I defeated was my dad. The woman that I married as a reward was my mom. My children are my siblings. Everything is wrong. Everything is wrong. And he's ruined. Or the tragedy ruins him. That moment of ruin, they define as ate. But the other definition, which is critical to understanding this Aeschylean framework of human character, is blindness. Ate is also blindness. Your ruin is brought about through the things you can't see because of your temptation by your delusions. Right? You've misread reality. And the whole way through it made sense to you. It felt persuasive. And you followed that road until suddenly you look up and you realize you've wrecked everything. So apate and apathy, I don't think they're related. I think it's a coincidence, but I could be wrong. They might be related. Not sure. Ate and apate, however, are certainly related to each other. Ap is a prefix attached to ate to create apate. So the Greeks are doing that grammatical thing they do, where you can derive an enormous number of words through simple, suffixes.
The last question was more about, are they related to entheos, if I'm pronouncing it right? Because entheos, you said that was like possession by a god or something.
Yes. All of these terms we're talking about involve daimons, and daimons involve states of possession. All of this is entheos. And so this is why the Greeks are so centered on this idea that the structure of the human mind is based on the idea that your character rules over you like a daimon. And it is in the nature of that daimon to be possessed by other daimons. You can resist the ones you're on guard against, but you can't resist the ones you're not on guard against, you're especially vulnerable to. And of course, daimons aren't necessarily bad. The keres are the bad daimons. You want to be open to the good daimons. I mean, if honesty and virtue and courage and love come your way, you don't want to be closed off against them and say, I'm philoctos against truth. It's like, no, now you lack semathesy, right? So there's, these are complex issues. It all depends on what you're encountering and whether it would be healthy for you, which is why sophrosune is the most important term in the entire framework. You always have to know which way the compass should be pointing you so that you can compare what you're actually doing to what you ought to have been doing and figure out how to correct them. So Zeus, says Aeschylus, and says the whole Greek framework, has so constructed human beings that all of these things we're talking about are the structure of our character. And it sets us up so that if we invest in good character, in having sympathecy so that we are receptive to the good daimons and so that we're phylactos against the bad daimons, if we do that, then when contingency comes our way, it can't tempt us as easily into doing the wrong thing. But if we ignore our character and just take it for granted and assume we're good people, if we have too much arrogance, especially if it rises to the level of insolence, but even just native arrogance, then it's going to leave us aphylactos against all these daimones. And if we are in that condition, the best thing that could happen for us, according to Diogenes, is that we have a leash, right? I want a sensei who's wiser than I am. I want a parent who's wiser than I am. I want coworkers who are more experienced than I am so that they can hem me in and keep me from, burning my hand on the hot stove. But if I'm unlucky and I don't have that, or worse, if I'm given a whole bunch of money and power until I'm in a condition of plautos, then I'm a menace to the world around me and to myself. And under those conditions of injustice, Zeus corrects the problem that the society created by using his ministers of justice, the tragic passions, to tempt me into overreach until I collapse and I'm replaced. This is the framework. And the last two parts, or the last one part, I did the next last. Here's the last part, the very last part is this. What are the tempters? We've talked about the role that all these different things play. Now, what exactly tempts you? And you can learn to look for this in the tragedies when you read them. When does one of these things come up? Because when it comes up, you know what kind of temptation it's going to be, and you can predict the outcome, what the nature of the crisis is going to be. So the inward tempters are eros, violent desire, the spirit of having things. Elpis, which is hoping for more than you should. And peitho, dangerous persuasion. Somebody says the thing that you want to hear, right? The whole basis of advertising. They figure out where your weaknesses are in your character, and then they create an ad that appeals to those weaknesses. And you go, why, yes, I do want to have sex with all kinds of scantily clad women, so I will drink this Budweiser beer. I mean, the commercial showed he drank the beer and suddenly bikini-clad women were hanging off of him. So, I need to drink the beer. I don't want to be lonely anymore. Sitting in my apartment downing Budweiser is definitely going to solve my loneliness problem. This is what the commercial is saying. Peito, I'm persuaded, right? So these are inward tempters. But there's also the outward tempter. And this is the one that Thucydides makes the point of over and over in his history of the Peloponnesian War. 2K, fortune, the unexpected reversal, the unexpected reversal. And what they're most afraid of is good fortune. You say good fortune is the most destructive tempter of character. So the Athenians happen to land in the right place at Sparta at the right time to take over a province because the Spartans are busy somewhere else. And that tempts them into thinking there wasn't any luck involved. It was all, Athens must just be that good. Winners win. We must just be winners. And so they overreach. Well, this is great. Now that we've got this, we've got Sparta on the run, let's also invade Sicily and conquer Syracuse. They're tempted by these outward circumstances of luck. And they wouldn't have been vulnerable to that if they had worked on their own character. But Thucydides' argument is they were strong in external power, but weak in character. And the result was their response to victory was to overreach until they finally defeated themselves. They wrecked themselves. Athens was a problem for the Greek world, and Athens cured itself. I mean, at great cost to everybody else, but it cured itself. And that's how Zeus has organized justice in the world. That's the structure. So these were the last things I wanted to get through today. This sets up the basic framework. And once you've got this basic engine, it's easy enough to understand that the Greeks cataloged over 100 daimones in addition to what's listed here. Different ways in which different things you could be possessed by that could distort your character if the engine that we've described has warped you to the point that you're not on guard, that you're vulnerable to it. There's a long list of them. Envy, strife. I mean, you've heard the names, right? They're listed frequently as these sort of anthropomorphized qualities. Despair. And these are all daimones, they're charis. But they can't hurt you unless your character is open to them. And what we've discussed so far is how to figure out whether or not your character is open and what you ought to be doing and cultivating your character, blah, 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 blah. All of this is sort of not necessarily in this exquisite level of detail, but all of this is sort of the framework that the Greeks have in mind every time they mention character. They say a word and they mean this whole book that we've gone through. They mean all this stuff. It's this whole framework for them about how human beings work. If they say any of these key words, they're invoking the rest of them in all these systematic relationships. But we never learned this in school. So, and we don't learn this not only about them, we don't ourselves have any equivalent substitute. We believe in the body is a computer and food is a fuel and the mind is the body's a machine. food is fuel and the brain is a computer. So, just program people to do what you want, right? Just more facts, more education, some programming. There, I got what I wanted. This is our model that's equivalent to what we've described here. And our model can hardly explain human behavior at all. We're constantly surprised by the things that we do. But the Greeks wouldn't have been surprised at all. It all makes sense to them. We're weak in our character. so we're open to all these vices. Okay, Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. You've been waiting a long time.
Yeah, I want to go back to in a way that would relate to what you're saying between the whatness and the thatness. The problem with the whatness, which is the question, is that there's nothing concrete. I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, it could be this, it could be that. And it seems to me like it needs to be made, actualized. And then in a way, the laws actualize the concept of what's right. So I'm going to go to the law of Hammurabi, which is the first law code that was written. And obviously, as human beings, we are finite beings. So we can't actualize the whatness into thatness in a complete way. There's going to be holes, going to be mistakes, there's going to be overreach, unintended consequences. And apparently somebody asked Hammurabi, he said, well, the laws are nice, but it seems like there's a lot of good stuff and there's a lot of bad stuff. Could we just have the good stuff and not have the bad stuff? And Hammurabi apparently replied, no, they're the two sides of the same coin. And I wonder whether that two sides of the coin, to what degree it actually exists in the universe, or whether that is a manifestation of the invisible lack of understanding of the finite mind versus the infinite possibilities. Okay, so that being the case, it seems to me like laws by its very nature is going to have flaws. It's going to have the badness, the unintended consequences, because we can never really give the laws like God, if there was a God. Okay, so therefore, God's law, if there was a perfect God, it would be perfect, but we don't have that. So we're living, east of Eden, and we're doing the best we can. I think some of you might have misunderstood my complaint about humanism. I'm a total humanist in this sense, but I see the flaws in humanity, and that maybe has to do with the unintended consequences of the limited mind. The problem is that human beings see humanism as something I consider like I should say well the turn of the human mind. I mean, a kind of selfish. Uh, uh, Copernican is the Copernican turn, okay, that we see the universe. And it, in a funny way, I think we see it like, even when we see the degradation of nature and we are trying to improve it, and some of us are trying to improve it. But I would say, I want to confess myself, I'm not putting much energy. I see a lot of people trying very much to help that. Is that the general public seem to see, oh yeah, there's something wrong, and and we're going to suffer from it. We're going to try to fix it, only so that we could be better. My thought about the degradation of nature is living things have rights. Maybe not the human right, but they have rights, and we have violated those rights. That's a different concept because I want to expand humanism beyond just the human boundaries of what is good for us, right? Like if we keep cutting down the forest, we're not going to be able to breathe. We better not do it. So we'll try to replant forests, right? That's not the reason. The forest needs to be there because a creature that depends on the forest, they're living things, okay? So that seems to be a very, very different attitude than just say, no, we got to fix this because otherwise we're going to strangle to death. We're not going to have water. We're not going to have all these things that we need. But I think nature, other living beings, they have rights. Maybe not the same rights as we have, but they have rights, and we have to give them the right to a certain degree. And you could see how that that applies to slavery. Once we thought the black people don't have rights, but now we realize that they do have rights. But that's within human beings, and I think it should be expanded. Then, to the fact that, oh, if we destroy nature, no, it's no problem. We could just move to Mars. We have the technology. We have the brilliance. We are smarter than God. We could invent the technology to take us to another planet. And it's interesting how they're desperately searching for another environment. Not that we necessarily go there, but that could sustain life. I wonder to what degree that is like, oh, we find that there are other beings that could live there, or whether it's like, no, someday we could just go there because, like, whatever. So we already have a plan to, in a sense, overcome that because we could just go with Star Trek or Star Wars, just expand our humanity. Uh, I I think that might be a funny thing. I recently, I think this was in a Plato meeting, and after the meeting, I mentioned, what if another being came onto our planet and they were obviously much more intelligent than we are? They got it worked out much better. Would we welcome them as our emperors, or would we, what we do? And I was just shocked, particularly in a Plato meeting. So many people said, "Oh no, we're going to try to terminate them because that's who we are. We want to kill these things that are a threat to us." So the bottom level of that is not that we deserve to be on top because we're the smartest. It's because we actually end up dominating everything. And if something smarter came along, we got to kill them before they dominate us. And I was shocked by that. It's like, and I actually said, well, the James Webb Telescope discovered a code that seemed like it was not a natural code, that it might be a language of some sort. They haven't proven that yet, but nonetheless, that's a possibility. Uh, Coming from Andromeda. And I said, well, these guys, if they could send a message that we only began to send in the early part of the 20th century, anything like that, but it takes 26 million light years or something like that to reach us. They are 26 million light years ahead of us. How in the hell we're gonna fight them and terminate them? I mean, they got better weapons, like so. I mean, that's insane, like we even by that standard, the power, they're gonna terminate us. So I was just sort of surprised that, oh, that's interesting. So that whole thing falls apart that we are not the rational beings we're going to be.
Right.
We are the violent beings that we actually are. So I was shocked, particularly at a Plato meeting in which everybody's supposed to be super rational thinkers, that sort of thing. So anyway, I think nature has rights, not that we are going to preserve nature so that we could sustain ourselves. I mean, those are two different arguments.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Well, and it's also typical of moderns to claim to be objective on the one hand, and on the other hand, speaking on behalf of humanity and saying, who are we? What are we capable of or not capable of? When hardly any of us can recite even the last 4,000 years of history with any level of fidelity. And 4,000 years of history is maybe 1% of the time our species has been on the planet. We know so little about the possibilities of how human beings can live and relate to the world. But we just assume that whatever we happen to be doing at the moment is binding upon our species. Nobody could be fundamentally different than we are now. We represent the norm. And so if we're violent and acquisitive now, then that must mean all people were always violent and acquisitive. We sort of erase 396,000 years of history and say, none of that ever happened. The only thing that happened is what's happening now. This is the sum total of who we are and what we can accomplish. It's just the lack of humility, the lack of even curiosity about what our possibilities might be. It is astonishingly ironic coming from the epoch that prides itself on being the most realistic. That we have so much contempt for the possibilities in reality. We don't know what we could do. We don't know how we could live. We don't know how we could be. We only know how we are now, and we know some caricatures of how people were in the recent past, and then we don't know anything before that at all, really. We just don't. James, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. It seems like we're talking about human nature, human nature, as if we were not part of nature, that we are somehow separate and distinct from nature, and that's a fallacy, because we wouldn't be able to survive if we didn't depend on nature to for our basic sustenance, basic needs, air and food and so forth. And at the same time, we're, treating the world, the earth, as if it is somehow an objective thing outside of us, and I think I think the Greeks that you've just been describing with all these characteristics, how many of these characteristics are there? You mentioned something like 64 or something.
There's over 100.
Yeah, over 100. Okay, yeah.
We,
And I think Greeks, yeah, that's really interesting. I think the Greeks had a very insightful understanding of human nature, of the human psychology. And that's why Freud went back to Oedipus and that period to point out the Oedipus represents this kind of a human being who is who is unaware of himself and who is lacks self-understanding of his own psychology. But the Greeks are, through the plays and through the through the artists and the philosophers, were very insightful, and they point out all these different forces operating within our human psychology, and and they elevated them to kind of laws that we should abide by. But it's really actually a kind of an understanding, isn't it, about ourselves? If you can absorb those concepts, you would have a very insightful understanding of yourself and be able to avoid your tragic fate, as it happened to Oedipus. So so yeah, so it's not so much that they're laws, except that maybe the laws are something like they establish them as laws to make people adhere to them, as if as if there were laws that you have to abide by.
Yes.
But it is, like Bob Dylan had a line in one of his songs, says, "To live outside the law, you must be honest." So I think being honest means to be able to understand yourself, and admit that you have these flaws and weaknesses and so forth, and you should adhere to your strengths, like Sophrosine and all these, arete and so forth. And so that's how I would interpret what these mean. And
Yeah.
and it's we're kind of out of sync with ourselves because of the way we're treating, parts of ourselves as if it was objectively not part of ourselves, destroying, polluting and destroying parts of nature as if it didn't matter. The oceans are polluted. We depend on the ocean for our sustenance, and so, there's a word for what that they come up with called Anthropocene, which is how humans are, you know, affecting nature, the world, the earth, so dramatically, and being out of sync with the forces of nature. And so is that a correct way to understand what these are? These myths, they're myths, but they're myths that are derived from an understanding of human nature and man's relationship with nature and the psychology of the human being in relation to the world, right?
Yes. It's a psychological system completely independent of Freud and Jung and the 19th and 20th century development of psychology. It's an alternative framework for understanding how human beings work. And it is at least as expressive as the one that we're using now. And it's better able to predict some of the crazy things that we do, which Freud's steam engine model of the mind has its limitations, right? This is more interesting than it's saying it's not just steam. It's like you are of more than one mind. You have competing sets of ideas inside you, and who prevails over whom inside your head to determine what you're going to do is not random. It has to do with your character and your conditions. It's a fascinating thing that they've put together here. And I think one way to think about this issue of natural versus artificial is as follows. The Greeks' critique is that most animals don't need anything like this because they have that framework of instincts that gives them sophrosune. They're born with and at least a partial sophrosune, and they're acculturated by their parents and their habitat into developing the rest of the sophrosune until, not 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, a mammal pursues something that's good for it, but we don't. And so this is where the Greeks would put the division. They'd say, on the one hand, we're part of nature. We evolved within nature, and we're certainly dependent on nature. But on the other hand, we lack this compass that all the other animals have. And we have to try to cobble it together and simulate it through learning and culture and the development of our character. Take care, Ari. It was great talking to you. We have to simulate it and develop it in order to have the possibility of doing half as well at doing the right thing as mammals do. It is George Bernard Shaw, isn't it, who said, no man organizes his life half so well as a tree does, at least after the first 9 months. Once he's been born, he can only envy a tree at how well the tree seems to do the right thing. We really don't. And that is the artifice. That's where the artificiality lies. It's in the need to culturally construct a substitute for the missing sophrosune. That's the Greek take, right? That's their whole framework for the relationship of psychology and character and nature and culture and society and what should be done and value systems. The whole thing comes out of this core observation that we lack we aren't born with the compass the way that the other animals are. We have to struggle to get even half of a compass going. And it's such a struggle that it would be foolish of a society not to put a lot of attention and effort into making that acculturation process work. Because if you don't make it work, then you're going to produce people who just don't know what the right thing is to do, and they do the wrong thing, and your society falls apart. So it can't be in society's interest to self-destruct. So the society really doesn't have time to spare conning and scamming one another and trying to, rip one another off. That's a wasted opportunity. That time and energy could have been used trying to improve our chances of survival.
It makes the this makes the Ten Commandments very simplistic, but the Ten Commandments also attempts to take into account human flaws and human weaknesses, right? It makes them into commandments, laws, and so forth.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. So this is and it's when religion is firing on all cylinders, when it's doing its job properly, what religion is trying to do is to document sacred law and help to hem in what could otherwise be the chaos of unrestrained ego and all of these other charis, these daimones that the Greeks warn us about. So this all comes to Martin Luther King Jr. in a moment, but first let's call on Stephen. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, I still have that warning of values, and many people contemplate a lot of values, and certainly there is a place for values. We couldn't have civilization without values, and of course I don't mean facts, but I mean what we create as our values. And it seems to me that most people seem to be so involved in virtue signalling. It's as though they're pleading with something to reward them for their virtue. And to me, I'm a bit wary of this. This sort of strikes me as a sort of a self-indulgence. I'm a bit wary of it. But what I am going to say is I'll just remind people that when we use the word Greeks, I'll modify that in accordance with Oswald Spengler, because he said what became the Greeks wasn't just the Greeks. He claimed that the Greco-Roman culture really began around 1500 BC. And it began in the Levant, it began in Egypt, it began with the Phoenicians, it began even with the Hebrews. All that time, the Greeks were Achilles. Their great talent was knocking heads. And he talked about this period from about 1500 to about 1000 BC as being a period of Greek infancy. And he said, say, from about 1000 BC to 500 BC was the youth of that culture. And it finally comes to fruition from about 500 BC to about zero. With the rise of the Caesars, as far as he's concerned, it was this wonderful culture had finally gone cactus. This is when the flower wilted in the very imperial Rome we worship. The Colosseum, all that, the massive structures. To him, that was the death of spirit. That was the entombment of spirit. The Colosseum was just a big tombstone to the Grecian civilization. But his warning is, watch out when you talk about the Greeks. The fact is, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Orient was all building up the stepping stone that the Greeks rose on. They took the ideas that were in the Middle East and took them to the next level. But the Greeks couldn't have done it without those cultures. For example, the Assyrian Empire was the first empire that really understood how to keep and maintain an empire on the mass scale. Everybody else copied them later on. They didn't bother anymore with kings in the lands they conquered. They appointed a governor. They just tied up the king with the rest of the slaves and whipped them along the road to wherever they were going to send them. That's how you run an empire. You know, the Carthaginians spread throughout the Mediterranean. There's some evidence that, well, you know, that town that Oedipus was from might have been a Phoenician colony in the very early days. So best remember, when we say the word Greeks, we're only talking about the module that made it to the moon. The Greeks got where they were because they stood on the shoulders of giants. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah,
Could I ask Stephen a question?
please.
To what degree you make a good case for the Greco-Roman culture emerging from from a whole tradition, Middle East. To what degree was the Bronze Age collapse a necessary ingredient for the emergence of the Greeks? Because they took advantage of a society that has collapsed and there's new possibilities that arise out of that. Otherwise, they would never have arisen because they were good at fighting, but they didn't have the kind of overwhelming culture that was already in Persia, and the Egyptians and so forth. So, could you say something about that? Was it that culture that did it, or was it a collapse of the culture?
A hybridization of culture.
Yeah.
There might be a case in Phoenicia. It could be that the Phoenicians were Canaanites, people of the Levant, and in came the Sea Peoples. And somehow they fused to create the Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians might not have been able to become the Phoenicians. They would have just simply remained Canaanites without somehow the Sea People bringing in this idea of getting on boats and really going all the way.
Yeah. Well, it absolutely it's true that the Greek alphabet, the early Greek alphabet came from the Phoenicians. Yeah. There's a relation. In fact, the Phoenicians were the one that in a way is credited to inventing the alphabet. So that part is absolutely true. So
or statues, for example. You know, ancient Egypt did statues. They were doing statues everywhere. The Greeks didn't do much good in the way of statues. They took that statuary, that sculpture from the Middle East.
Yeah. Well,
looked a bit dead, and they perfected it. And of course,
that's right. The early Greek statue is not very, very good. That's right. Absolutely.
Well, can we beat what the Greeks were doing in the time of Pericles?
Oh no, no.
That was perfection. I don't know if you can beat it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so let's bring this home. I want to start with a little bit of text from Gilbert Murray in the preface to his translation of the Agamemnon. Because this is where he talks about some of these same things that Cornford has talked about. And there's some interesting terminology here. He says, the trilogy of the Oresteia, of which the Agamemnon is the first part, centers on the old and everlastingly unsolved problem of the ancient blinded vengeance and the wrong that amendeth wrong. Every wrong is justly punished, yet as the world goes, every punishment becomes a new wrong, calling for fresh vengeance. And more, every wrong turns out to be itself rooted in some wrong of old. It is never gratuitous, never untempted by the working of patho, persuasion, never merely wicked. The Oresteia first shows the cycle of crime punished by crime, which must be repunished. And he means in the Agamemnon. We see Agamemnon and Cassandra's murder by Clytemnestra. And then seeks for some gleam of escape, some breaking of the endless chain of evil duty, right? So Orestes in the second play has to come and kill Clytemnestra for having murdered his father. And then he has to flee because now he's the guilty party. And, the Furies, the Eumenides, as they will later be called, are pursuing him. And finally, in the third play, is the great trial that's held that makes it possible to break the chain of evil duty, as he says, some breaking of the endless chain of evil duty. And we get a new kind of justice on the earth, according to the trilogy. In the old order of earth and heaven, there was no such escape. Each blow called for the return blow and must do so ad infinitum. But according to Aeschylus, there's a new ruler now in heaven, one who has both sinned and suffered and thereby grown wise. He is Zeus, the third power, Zeus, the savior, and his gift to mankind is the ability through suffering to learn, which is the phrase pathematos, learning through suffering. And that's a gift. This is the Olympian religion going all the way back to the founding of the Olympic project, 776, 800 BCE, is promoting this idea that the great virtue of the Olympians, the reason why they represent progress over the Titan religion of old, is that within the Titan religion of old, we were trapped within these cycles of vengeance. That was as close to justice as we could come. And yet that trap illustrated generation after generation how justice was generating injustice. It wasn't working. And so Zeus's great gift is the ability to suffer and learn. And the basis of that suffering and learning is the structure of human character and the way that daimons work in us and symathesy and our capacity to question even our favorite apate, our favorite delusions, when circumstances kind of herd us into a corner from which there's no escape, which we can't rationalize anymore. And we're forced to accept, like Oedipus, we're forced to accept the truth, whether we like it or not. And only then can we grow. And that growth is progress, because at least it gives us an option to get out of the labyrinth that we've been trapped in all of our lives. And that's what makes this suffering a gift. That it's not that it's guaranteed to lead to wisdom, but it can lead to wisdom. That they're in the same way that the medieval religion is going to say, no matter how much evil you've done in the world, if you repent and throw yourself on the mercy of God, there is always a path to salvation. You're never doomed, says the medieval religion. There's always hope for you. This is what the Zeus religion is saying before that. Under polytheism, the Olympic religion is saying there is a way out of these traps, these ancient generational traps that we've been stuck in. And it has to do with human character and suffering and the capacity to learn. And that is one of the most important features of the character of Homo sapiens, that we have this capacity under the right circumstances, even to learn the things that although we need to learn, that we don't want to learn, we still can learn them. We're never fully trapped if only our character and our circumstances will come together in the right way to offer us pathematos. So again, you see how this changes the understanding of the word character or ethos, right? I think until you've gone through this reading and seen all this and thought about it and debated it, for most of us, the concepts of character and salvation don't seem to be inextricably linked. I mean, we can see that it's possible for them to be related, but they don't seem inevitably part of the same system. But in the Olympian religion, they are. Salvation comes through character and suffering. That's the road. That's the way out, according to this ancient religion. And this is, again, it's not something that they teach. When we learn Greek mythology, they don't teach us this about Greek mythology. But this is the core of the Greek religion. This was the whole basis for the Olympics and for the tragedies and the epics and the cycles, and their whole framework and structure of their culture is based around this concept of pathematos. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to thank you for tying Aeschylus to Sophocles, because as you were talking about the Orestes cycle, it reminded me of the I guess the other cycle of Oedipus. Historically, I mean, chronologically, the play is supposedly, like Sophocles, no, not Sophocles, whoever it is, Oedipus came first, right? That play came first, chronologically in terms of storytelling, and then uh,
Agamemnon.
no, no, not Agamemnon. Then
Oh, you're talking about Oedipus Tyrannus versus Oedipus at Colonna versus the Electra's
no, versus uh, I just forgot all versus Antigone.
Antigone.
Antigone, I
Antigone.
suppose they came last, and
Yeah.
then uh,
Oedipus at Colonna.
Oedipus Colonus came in the middle. But
Yes.
the order it was written is the important thing. The order was written as Antigone came first, and then Oedipus, uh, uh, and then Oedipus Colonus came
Yeah.
last. So the sequence of that is very interesting, and I don't know whether that reinforces to what degree or whether it has a kind of criticism to Aeschylus in this in Oresteia. Because if you look at the sequence as is written, the first one was a criticism of the relationship of the laws Creon created in relationship to what Antigone was fighting for, which is that a kind of unwritten tradition of the family binding relationship. Okay, and so there was a violation that the laws themselves was a violation of the tradition uh, of what is right, what does everybody think is right. And then, of course, then it came to Oedipus Rex, in which, yeah, when you give it to the individual, he also screws up the government. so, so that's an interesting thing. So there's something about the relationship of the government uh, to some unwritten laws in both cases. And then Oedipus and Colonus, interesting, he finally became oriented to nature. He was in tune with nature. So it went outside of the laws of government. That nature got turned him into a kind of a Zen master who
Right.
just in tune with nature and was very, even though he's blind, he could see much better in a funny way. So that's an interesting. I don't know whether that cycle on the one hand repeats Orestes, but on the other hand, it seems to be a subtle criticism of Orestes too, that coming together in the laws themselves was already criticized
Yeah.
in the first play in Antigone. The laws was a violation already.
Yeah.
So that's a very thank you for those two trilogies coming and of course Aeschylus came before
Yeah.
Sophocles. So therefore Sophocles had to either respond or just totally at random. But
Right.
it just seemed too neat to be just totally at random. So there must be a criticism of some sort
There's some kind of
about
conversation going on.
that.
I agree. I agree. I don't understand it well enough yet to say what that conversation is, but you can tell from how thoughtful these guys are and how aware they are of each other that there has to have been a conversation there.
Well, I think the conversation with Sophocles was that the laws themselves are inadequate, civilization is inadequate, nature reigns supreme. That is the real unwritten law in a funny way.
Yes. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I think I want to agree with Phil in a way. We've had from Aeschylus that the natural law, the divine law, can start this circle of violence, continuing here. But I'm just having dim memories of some lectures on Antigone, Sophocles' Antigone from God knows when, that the problem there is, as like Kurt Gödel might have said, these laws are inconsistent. You know, that Antigone rightly asserts under divine law the right to bury your brother. And Creon asserts, as king, her brother shall not be buried. And so the laws rightly lead to, we would say now, contradictions. But there they lead to comments, conflict in the terms of the play. And I think that's what it's like. Yeah, when the Greeks finally got to thinking about all this law stuff and tried to deduce more logically what the consequences of all this was, it was, oh crap, what have we got ourselves into? I don't know. But I really want to agree with Phil in some way and just throw in this stuff from 50 years ago. That yes, there are problems in divine law itself and how it ripples through society. There are problems in reconciling divine law and human law.
Yes.
And they cause trouble all around.
Yes. Yes. Kind of tying that to what James was asking about earlier about natural versus artificial. One of the ways to think about this is that, Heraclitus says, first he says nature loves to hide, and then he says the hidden harmony is better than the obvious. And he's talking about the way that the fundamental archi, the principles of the cosmos that from which natural laws derive, are hidden from us. They're under the surfaces of things, and yet they're authoritative. So the authority that is binding upon us is also invisible to us. We can't quite see what we're supposed to do. And that presents one of the biggest problems for Homo sapiens. It's why it would have been convenient if we'd been born with Sophrosune, because then we wouldn't have had to try to reason our way to this invisible conclusion that's correct and somehow avoid all these invisible conclusions that are false. It's like that's a challenge that's like unfair almost for Homo sapiens.
It does seem like it's much easier to get to the fact that as a creature, an organism within nature, that man has there are guiding archae, guiding principles that govern his evolution and everything. But it's more difficult to say, well, just what are some, name three. Come on, you're so smart. Mm-hmm. Give me three, or something. Because we don't have that view of ourselves. We have a view of ourselves, and people see different things. It's really great. Know thyself. I repeat that, all the time. But what is it I'm knowing? And how, and especially since I also think, yes, there is an essence there. We're not these pure will existentialists.
Right.
But, and because we do, if we're honest, bump up against constraints, bump up against character. Character seems utterly real.
Yes.
We observe it phenomenologically. It's like my father-in-law said, well, I'm glad Diane married you because that other guy was a jerk just like his dad. Without thinking, there's some profound characterological wisdom in this casual observation.
Yes. Yes.
So enough.
It's good though. So let's bring it home. So here's one translation of a pregnant passage from Agamemnon by Aeschylus. And it echoes what Gilbert Murray says in the introduction. But this is not Gilbert Murray's translation. This is another one. Gilbert Murray's translation is in verse. This is prose. Zeus, who sets mortals on the path to understanding. Zeus, who has established as a fixed law that wisdom comes by suffering. And I'm just going to intercept for a moment and say fixed law. He's talking about kata phusea, according to nature. He's saying it's not a law. It's not just that Zeus feels like it ought to be this way. Zeus is documenting and communicating the truth of the cosmos, that just like gravity and electromagnetism and all these other things outside ourselves are lawful and follow binding laws, so as Heraclitus says, the world within us is also natural and follows binding laws. But it's harder for us to see what they are because it's invisible inside us, whereas it's visible outside of us. So it's a harder problem, but it's every bit as important to figure out what those laws are. This is what all of this framework from Cornford and Thucydides and Aeschylus is about. It's starting to fill in this enormous empty gap in modern's understanding of the world. We spend a lot of time understanding the laws of nature around us and hardly any time trying to understand anything like laws of nature inside us. We have this delusion that inside ourselves we're free, which means there are no laws. Right? Our delusion is that we are the God of Genesis who rules over the nature inside of us, but it's not true. We are not. We are bound by our character. And all of this stuff we've been talking about is an attempt to replace that modern delusion with kind of the ancient model of what they thought that the laws of nature were inside of people. And he's saying, what Aeschylus is saying is that Zeus was the one who documented these laws and communicated them to people, that you can learn by suffering, you can learn wisdom by suffering. Says, but even as trouble, bringing memory of pain, drips over the mind in sleep, so wisdom comes to men whether they want it or not. Harsh, it seems to me, is the grace of gods enthroned upon their awful seats. So, oh my God, it's some great prose. It's quite a good translation. So Kenneth taught me an ancient Greek class over a decade ago. Back when I had more money than I have now, I was able to pay him to teach me a one-person class, and we tried to record as much as we could before my disk drive crashed, alas. But here's a paragraph out of that class. It talks about this very issue. And I'm sharing it with you because you aren't going to find it anywhere else. It's like it's in the notes on my computer and nowhere else on earth, although he's probably said it before. He says, taught by suffering, drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain. This is the link between Aristeia and the tragic ethos. A Greek Aristos would rather be educated by suffering than be happy his whole life long, because you don't get educated by happiness. No one is wised up by getting things the way he wants. That just consolidates the idiotism in him, makes his ego think the world exists for its sake, as the ego has always suspected, right? And this should be echoing that stuff up above, where we were talking about the Athenians mistaking fortune for their own power and thinking that if they won that battle with Sparta, then now they can conquer Sicily. This is what he's referring to here. He says, suffering shows the schism between what we want and how the world is organized. Or put another way, between what we want and the actual laws of nature. The contraindication the world gives us that we've been strategizing from totally wrong precepts. Suffering is the collision between human delusions and real truth. Not every human being has equal potential to learn from suffering. Some people just suffer or just respond with alternative tactics without learning anything. And the last piece before we go to MLK, building on this, is from Robert Kennedy's eulogy to Martin Luther King Jr. when he addressed the nation in the wake of the riots that came after Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. He says, he had a lot to say about what a great man Martin Luther King was. But then he says, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He wrote, in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. And that was how he wrapped up his eulogy to Martin Luther King Jr. So this is why, to me, Aeschylus, Thucydides, Cornford, Gilbert Murray, Kenneth Smith, and Martin Luther King Jr., there is this whole confluence of close relationships here. And one of the ways that you can see it is not just through Martin Luther King Jr.'s reference to judging people by the content of their character in his I Have a Dream speech. A lot of Americans read fragments of his speeches, or sometimes even entire speeches online, and never read his books. And if like I used to be, if you're one of those people who's never bought or read one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s books, I highly recommend you pick one up. He is a great writer. He's not just a great speech giver, he's a great writer. And in his books, he's able to talk at greater length about these topics that matter to him. And you're going to find the topic of character coming up over and over and over. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community is one of his books. And that was the one I quoted from earlier. And this is where the full circle comes around, because Martin Luther King Jr. is summarizing in a beautiful way the medieval critique of the ancient world. When he says, segregation is also morally wrong because it deprives man of freedom, that quality which makes him man. The very character of the life of man demands freedom. And speaking of freedom, I'm not referring to the freedom of a thing called the will. The very phrase freedom of the will abstracts freedom from the person to make it an object. And an object, almost by definition, is not free. He's talking about synapthy there, even though he doesn't use the word, right? Says, but freedom cannot thus be abstracted from the person, who is always subject as well as object, and who himself still does the abstracting. So I'm speaking of the freedom of man, the whole man, and not the freedom of a function called the will. Says people, he's saying to self-actualize, to grow into their arete, to become the thing, the best parts of their potential. Human beings cannot be in relations of slavery. Not segregation, not slavery, not any other form of oppression. If you are bound in and not allowed to grow, then the greatest gifts that you have to offer are never going to come to blossom. They're going to be hemmed in by those pressures. And as a result, you're not going to flourish. And since you don't flourish, you're never going to really be happy. But the society around you isn't going to flourish either. Because what were those gifts that you would have shared with the society, that the society would have benefited from, that now the society is cut off from because of its misguided idea that it knew better than you what you ought to be doing with your life? And more importantly, this is the subtext of Martin Luther King's comment here. It's the belief that you know better than nature what a given person ought to be doing, because the character within them is their inner nature that is trying to grow and unfold and become the possibilities that they point towards. You know, the amount of variability in human beings and who they develop into is spectacular. There's just no telling what's going to come out of somebody if you let them grow and bloom. The person that you may have written off as a worthless loser who's good for nothing but digging ditches, they might have within them some gift of music or art or rhetoric, or even they could grow up to be Martin Luther King Jr. You don't know who they're going to grow up to be until the course of their life unfolds. This is core to the ancient Greek concept, the hidden harmony, right? The nature within that we can't see, that follows its own laws of unfolding and development. It's a Greek wisdom saying, never judge a man until he's died. You don't know who he's going to become. And it's not, I understand Stephen's concern. We're not saying that every single person is a beautiful, beautiful butterfly. They're all acorns and they all need to become oaks. What we're saying is you don't know which of them are and which of them aren't. Some people's characters are so crabbed they're never going to develop into anything. And other people's characters have amazing gifts within them waiting to emerge. And neither you nor they know who is whom. But the future of civilization depends on who is whom. This is the difficulty that Heraclitus tries over and over to turn our heads to. The thing that we can't see is the important thing. And it's an act of hubris to think that we know in advance what people can and can't develop into. It's insolence. And that insolence pits us against the sacred harmony of the cosmos. And by doing that, we're the losers. You never win a fight against gravity. You're never going to win against this stuff. And so you have to structure. This is why, the yes, this is why Pena and Plautos are relevant here. Martin Luther King Jr. in the last year of his life launched the Poor People's Crusade, in which he figured out how to create a larger movement within the United States, in which he stood against. It was a platform based on three things: opposition to poverty, opposition to war, and opposition to racism, because he'd established the relationship between the three in the United States in the 1960s. And that if you wanted to beat even one of them, you had to beat all three of them. They had to be taken down together. That for example, many white racist people who opposed equal rights for blacks did so because they themselves were poor, and they were afraid that the pie couldn't grow, and that the only way for black Americans to have equal rights was for white people to get even poorer than they were. They were trapped within the mindset of poverty. They couldn't imagine a bigger, better world. And so they fought against equal rights for black people because they thought equal rights for black people meant poverty for themselves. So Martin Luther King Jr. identified that if you come out against all three of these things at the same time, and you say, we're going to make a world without war and without poverty and without racism, it becomes more possible than if you just try to fight against racism, right? Without dealing with the reasons why people cling to these ideas. It was a brilliant insight, and it probably had something to do with why he was assassinated. He was getting dangerous traction from certain people's perspective. So, but all of this is based on this idea of character and recognizing that you can't convince people to do the right thing if their circumstances in life combined with their character point them in the opposite direction. You've got to address character and people's circumstances to help them to do the right thing. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I want to come off mute because what I want to say might diverge from the Martin Luther King, which seems very important. So
Okay.
I'll save it.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. So yes, I did some searches through. I've got 3 of Martin Luther King Jr.'s books, and I need to get more of them. And I did some searches through. I have digital copies as well as physical copies, and I did some searches through them for character. And boy, does he use the word character. He loves the word character. He talks about the character of individuals. He talks about the character of a nation. He talks about the character of our times. He talks about things that are characteristic of a situation. He talks about what characterizes something. He's just immersed in this. I mean, there was a stage in American education when everybody used to, everyone who got an education to a certain level used to study the classics. And as part of studying the classics, they studied Aeschylus, and they studied the role that character plays in Greek tragedy. And part of the reason why Robert Kennedy cites Aeschylus and his discussion of character in his eulogy for Martin Luther King Jr. is, he and Martin Luther King Jr. had lots of conversations about the situation in America and about human character and the character of the nation and so forth, and how are we to go forward as a people in some way with more justice than what we did in the past. So I like to feel like I don't have proof, but I like to feel like in that eulogy we're seeing just a hint of some of the conversations that he and Brother Martin used to have when they sat down together and talked about civil rights and how to change the world. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, now this would relate to your conversation. I mean, I actually love Robert Kennedy much more than John Kennedy. And I wonder to what degree he came to the Enlightenment about Martin Luther King, because he was the Attorney General for John Kennedy. And I don't think he, at least from what I know, I don't think he had such a warm relationship to the civil rights movement. I mean, he probably had some affinity to it, but wasn't quite that motivated. But was it John's death that either motivated him that even a president could be killed, or was it John's death that liberated him from the constraints of John to be more of himself? I mean, I see that there was a turn in his life that he became much more receptive to the civil rights movement than before when John was still alive. So I'm wondering what that was, because I certainly loved him when he was moving in that direction. But I wonder what was within him before John died, because he was the Attorney General and he could have done a lot more, probably as Attorney General at that time, but he really didn't do that much. So, would you say something about that? Have you know something?
I wish I could, because there's a lot about this that we still don't know,
Yeah.
about the relationships between these people at this time. Um, it's there when we get to the section on modernity, we'll talk some about the problem in the modern world of how much we put into our brands. Brand is everything for us. I mean, if your brand isn't good, you can't get a job. So you have to cultivate a brand that gets you a job. If your brand isn't good, you can't become president, or you can't become attorney general or a civil rights leader. And so there is an enormous amount of splits in moderns between our actual character and our persona, which is developed to advance our brand. And the result is it can be very difficult to untangle who somebody really is, especially as the politics gets thicker, the thicket gets in the way. So I don't feel like I understand either John F. Kennedy or Robert Kennedy particularly well. I feel like I have a better understanding of Martin Luther King Jr. because he sort of put himself out there in a way that there's a vulnerability to the way he went about his, being a person in public, that kind of exposed more of who he was. Not everything, but more of who he was. But Robert Kennedy, I don't feel like I fully understand him. I do know that, Martin Luther King Jr. spent more time with him than the rest of us, and that he had eventually come around to being about to endorse Robert Kennedy for president. Right before he was assassinated, he got killed. So, there's probably something worthwhile in the man beyond his brand, Robert Kennedy, that is. There's probably something worthwhile there that someone who spent a lot of person-to-person time with him could have seen. But I can't go in. I can't get into too much depth about it. What I can say is that Kenneth Smith has talked about this a little bit. He says you see in people like the Kennedys or like the Roosevelts, you see how there was a time in American politics when people who were more aristic than today could get further in politics than you can get today. Now it hardly anybody, I mean, Aristoi hardly have any place to appear at all in public life. But when you sort of look at the level of education and sacrifice and character that some of these people exhibit, it's not that they're perfect people; they have huge flaws, but that they have some of the family scent of Aristea. Like they've been near it, they've been dabbling in it, even if they never became it, even if they never became a fulfilled version of it. So I know that doesn't do any justice to your question, but I'm cautious about making these judgments about the people I haven't met personally. I'd be very comfortable saying, Kenneth Smith certainly has spent a lot of time trying to become as much of an Aristos as he can. He's really worked at it, because I know that personally. I know that from talking to other people who've interacted with him. I've got the direct experience, but I don't have that direct experience with Robert Kennedy. I was born in '66, so I was just not conscious enough during his life, and never met him. So I only have the persona to go on, the brand. Well, with that, I guess we are at an end, and next week we can advance in the text, as Sharon was encouraging us to do, But I will just point out, we already did this sentence a couple of weeks ago, but the sentence that the three sentences that all this comes back to is this. From what did ancient man need to be saved or delivered? From the asphyxiating webs of imperial authority and the ever more radical injustice of concentrated wealth. And now we're talking plotos, right? We know the term. We're talking about that level of wealth that destroys character. From the sordid degradations of a world system expert at ruining the integrity of the soul and bleeding off its morale. Salvation is not just a matter of repenting over one's personal sinfulness and weakness, although such self-slavery is a primary obstacle to spirituality. So he's saying, in effect, that according to the ancient psychology of character, Rome was convicted by its own value system of failing to be a society, failing to be a place where people could develop a healthy character. And as such, it was wrecking itself and the world, and it had to go. And this is what you're going to see the patristic church fathers are saying. This is their argument. They're saying by the ancient worldview's own value system, the ancient worldview has to end. And that's where we wrap up. I had a good time. I hope you did too. Have a great week.
Thank you.
As Ari always says, it's one of the highlights of my week. I love being here. And we'll talk to you next week.
Bye, Phil. Bye, Rick.
Bye.